A shiny sports beam was speeding down the motorway. Old rock rumbled from the speakers, drowned out by the roar of the engine. The electronic panel flashed an incoming video of a young guy's face. A man in his 40s slowed down slightly and turned down the sound. What had happened? Have the partners finally confirmed the delivery date, he thought. Mr. Smith, the date has been confirmed for 23rd May, the assistant said. 12 o'clock exactly, he said. Right, great. I'm on my way to the office. How's it going in there? We're good. We're going to order a pizza and get the paperwork done. I got it. I'll be there soon. The man ended the call and turned the music volume back up. The 23rd is only a week away. We have to make it look like a family. All right, a wife shouldn't be too hard to find. What about a daughter or son? Sam wondered. Flakes of snow began to fall from the sky. I had to slow down while the wipers worked hard. The car obediently turned off the track, and the roar of the engine was replaced by a quiet rumble. The snow intensified, and the businessman had to move closer to the steering wheel to avoid hitting anyone. He looked carefully at the pavement, watching for inattentive pedestrians. Suddenly, he spotted a girl selling dairy products on the curb. Oh, that's what I need. I'll get some milk for those gluttons, before they ruin their stomachs with pizza, he thought. The car pulled up to the curb. The saleswoman looked to be about 18 or 19, no more. Snowflakes were falling on the scarf tied round her head, smiling sweetly. The girl told Sam about the products. The man couldn't bear to hear her grinning tooth to tooth from the cold. He stood in his fur collar coat, but the frosty air tickled his nose unpleasantly. She had only a simple coat. I'll wrap it up for you, she said. The man looked at the small counter in surprise. The girl was confused for a moment. You probably have a large family. I'll pack everything up quickly. A shy smile ran across her lips, blue from the cold. At that moment, Sam had an epiphany. He looked closely at the girl's face. Gray eyes, blonde strands of hair covered by a scarf. This could be the way out. Sweet young lady, I don't want to scare you, Sam began. The girl continued to stack the products, but turned to the customer. I have to look like a family man at a few work meetings, and I've got everything but a family. Maybe you could help me out. I'll pay, sure. The girl stared at him wide-eyed, her cheeks flushed with color, and she lowered her gaze shamefully. I'm sorry, but I can't. She chose her words carefully and tied the sour cream packet as slowly as if she were walking on thin ice. Oh, you misunderstood me. I must have put it poorly. I'm not a maniac. Sam ran to the parked car and hastily pulled out his passport. Look, this is my passport. You can take a picture of it and give it to a reliable person. You'll need to pose as my daughter for a week, just a couple or 3 hours a day. Well, if only for a few hours, I think I can. The girl pointed her phone at the passport and took a few pictures. My mom is ill, and I'm taking care of her, so I can't leave for a long time. You'll be a great help. What's your name? Cynthia. Sam, you got a deal. I have to go now, but I'll call you. We'll talk details then. Sam took numerous bags of groceries in both hands. And if you don't mind, I'll have to go and buy you some suitable things beforehand. You can keep them later. I don't need them. Sam grinned. He was very pleased with himself. It had been so easy to resolve an issue that had been plaguing him for months. Ever since the branch negotiations had started, he felt a rush of spirits. The heated steering wheel was the best invention of mankind. Only 10 minutes in the cold, and already you need to warm up. It was different when he was young, he thought. The car rolled slowly down the avenue, and the man's thoughts drifted back to his youthful years. Then he had nothing at all. True, his clothes had been warm after all. His parents would never allow him to walk around in clothes beneath their status, their position. At an elite economics university, he had to make an impression worthy of his family's status. But that meant nothing at the time. His youthful soul wanted something else. Not a bank account with 7 zeros or a luxurious house, in which he eventually chose only the living room as his abode. Back then, he had dreamed of higher things, of faith, justice, and of course, love. He remembered the delicate scent of lavender and soap from the long blonde hair. Involuntarily, the man took a deep breath of air. His heart clenched painfully. Sam himself did not notice how he reached the office. The man tossed the car keys to the valet. Yes, now he could afford anything he wanted. He could even go a few years without working and not deny himself anything. So what? Youth is lost. There was no one to take care of but his employees. He forced himself back to reality. A contract, a competent, well-thought-out contract. That's what he should think about now, so that no clever lawyer would be able to pick on him. The evening passed in thought again. Sam looked at the falling snow and remembered his youth. The whiskey in his glass burned his throat. He walked over to the panoramic window and dusted off the coffee table, setting the glass between the mismatched figurines that looked like plastic trinkets and the ashtray full of cigarette butts. A cigarette slipped easily out of the crumpled packet, and the man opened the sliding door, a slim slit with a light movement. Along with the frosty air, children's screams from the neighboring house came into the room. The building itself could not be seen because of the falling snow, but that didn't stop the screams at all. Quickly finishing his cigarette, the man hurried to close the door and enjoyed the silence. Yes, better this way than to hear all these shrieks from morning till night, he thought. At least he had the freedom of choice. He took another sip and, grumbling, spat the rest into the floor pot with the withered bonsai. Tossing the damp dressing gown off the king-sized leather sofa, the man plumped tiredly into the soft embrace of his soft woman. He could have gone to the bedroom, but it made him homesick. He hadn't slept there once since Patricia had left. She was a housekeeper. He closed his eyes and remembered how tidy the place had been back then. It had been a good time. The house was filled with the smell of home-cooked food, fresh linen perfectly folded in the cupboards. The bedroom was being used for its intended purpose. Sam fell into a pleasant slumber. Outside the window there was barely a hint of dawn when Sam opened his eyes. Taking the customary 20 steps to the bathroom, he looked in the mirror in the close light. The wrinkles seemed deeper and gave him an extra dozen years, as if he should have been in his 60s by now. The electronic surface of the mirror glowed with the time 0700. All morning routines went on automatic. The ritual had become automatic over the years, and half an hour later Sam opened the door, bringing out a bag of ready-made breakfast. While the machine hummed, brewing black coffee, the man decided it would be a good idea to add cream. Greasy, but sometimes you could. From the depths of the fridge, a lone frozen courgette and several jars of sauce looked up at him. A smooth row of mineral water cans pressed against the open door. Behind them hid the cream. The man took the Tetra Pak and took a small sip. Oh, for fuck's sake. He hurried to spit out the bitter liquid. I'd better order the services of a housekeeper after all. The mere thought of shopping made Sam uncomfortable. He didn't want to go to the mall. But there was nothing to be done. Such a delicate matter couldn't be entrusted to an assistant, and Cynthia's clothes would have made her look like an ordinary girl. Even now, she stood in slightly stretched jeans with scuffs down the front, tucked into rough boots. A gray jumper was visible from beneath an unbuttoned-down jacket. She pulled off her hat and waved to Sam. Hey, Cynthia. You ready to go? Ready. Sam, the girl, lowered her eyes. She was probably embarrassed to call the man by his first name. He was old enough to be her father. But don't worry, it's just a bit of theater. And I'm your partner on the set. The man put his finger up, emphasizing his involvement in a great art. Slow rhythmic music was blasting through the mall, forcing shoppers, like ants caught in a clever trap, to walk endlessly between shiny shop windows and miles of colorful clothes. The escalator finally reached the top floor. This was where the most expensive boutiques were located, and it was much less crowded than the lower levels. Sam cherished the thought that very soon he would be able to sit down in a comfortable chair, and a pleasant employee would bring him a cup of coffee. And so it happened. As soon as they entered the first shop and explained the purpose of their visit, Sam was seated in a comfortable leather chair, and now all he had to do was evaluate the outfits. The process was going well. Cynthia obediently measured everything that was brought to her, and soon cardboard shopping bags began to multiply near Sam. They had to change several shops so that the brands would be different. Sam knew all too well the society he would be traveling to. Those rich kids were eagle-eyed about all the new collections, and if they suspected something wrong, they would quickly uncover the deception. Then the contract he'd been working towards for years would slip through his fingers. Cynthia carefully picked up another black velvet handbag decorated with ornate silver patterns. Sam nodded contentedly to the saleswoman, confirming that she should be packed as well. When at last he was sure that the girl was absolutely sure to be dressed as a rich heiress, he was relieved. It was necessary to finalize everything by stipulating the details. A small, dark restaurant on the same floor suited him just fine. Cynthia, look, it's a business meeting, but my partners are traditionalists, and they're all about family values. So you're supposed to be my daughter. Tell me a little bit about yourself so I know what kind of legend to make up. The man sipped his tea. I don't have much to tell. I work as a milkmaid. Now my mom is ill, and I had to look for a job near her house to take care of her. And when I have time, I sell my products, So it's a small business. The girl blushed and giggled. Did you study or go to school? Sam had a strange feeling that the girl's speech was too smooth and correct, without accent and common expressions. Milkmaids don't speak like that. Yes, I entered the history of art, but I had to take an academic course. Hopefully next year I'll be able to return to my studies. Well, good for you. But you're just like me, grinned the man. Why don't you have a family? I should probably find out more about you too, so that I can be prepared. Well, she doesn't need that information, of course. Well, I'll just have to tell her to relax a bit, Sam thought. I had a woman I loved once, but that was a long time ago. Then business, work. I didn't have time, and now I'm old, no one wants me. So you're a lone wolf? You could say that. The businessman smiled. During the time spent in the restaurant, Sam had managed to get Cynthia to talk a little, and his worries receded into the background. The girl's speech was pleasant. She possessed a slight irony. Their conversation flowed easily, and this inspired hope for the successful future of the deal. However, talking to a nice young girl, and even in such an unusual way, was new to the man. It was not the same as giving tasks to subordinates. All this fuss made Sam feel a migraine coming on. It would have been nice to take Cynthia home, but there was no more energy left for that. God bless whoever invented the taxi. Sam was relieved to see the red taillights of the yellow, checkered car moving away. That night the headache kept Sam awake. He tried to find some pills to relieve the attack, but they ran out, as always, at the worst possible moment. He closed the cap of the empty pill box and threw it in the rubbish bin. At first he wanted to call his assistant, who could bring him what he needed. But at the last moment he remembered that he'd just had a baby. Pulling him over in the middle of the night now would be too much. Sam flicked through the contact list on his phone and discarded it. A string of women's numbers, and no one to text. Either asleep or having fun like they'd had with him. Patricia would probably come and help him, but that would be too low. He remembered her tear-stained face when he told her he didn't love her. The pain clenched his temples even tighter. You old goofball, Sam thought, grabbed his phone and quickly dialed the number of the pay clinic. When you have money, you can afford to be lonely. In just 10 minutes, the friendly nurses gave Sam a strong injection, and the pain receded. You'll sleep like a baby tonight, smiled the young nurse. That's right, like a 45-year-old baby, he grinned. The car was quietly making its way along the off-road track. Cynthia, seeing the car, waved hello. Sam responded machine-like. Behind the girl's back stood a sturdy little house covered in snow. Now she looked unnatural against this background, like a bright spot against the gray industrial zone. The wheels slowed down next to a pair of beautiful light-colored boots with a small heel. The girl flicked back her blonde long strands and got into the car. Sam stood still for a moment, ogling her with his gaze. Careful, inconspicuous makeup, shiny hair, elegant manicure. Clothes only completed the image. Cynthia looked fresh and beautiful. Cynthia, you look great. Thank you, Sam, I'm really so excited. Not Sam, Daddy, the man put his finger up, reminding us of their arrangement. Yeah, Dad, the girl laughed. Everything's going to be fine, I'm sure. Okay, just a reminder, Mom's in Aspen skiing. The roads got snowed in, and she couldn't make the flight. And you're staying with me, your favorite daddy, getting ready for your winter session. I honestly don't think anyone will ask too much, but just in case, you know. Cynthia nodded decisively and made a gesture with her hand to her forehead, emphasizing that she was ready to follow instructions. I thought about calling me Cynthia. That's what my mom usually calls me, but I like the sound of it. The wheels slowly spun and the car set off on its adventure, supporting Cynthia under his arm. The man entered the small hall. The stage was hidden by a red velvet curtain, and there were tables in front of it. One large one was in the center and flanked by several smaller ones. An obliging steward waved his arms cheerfully. When he saw Sam, he shook his hand vigorously and inclined his head politely. Introducing Cynthia, he led them to a group of people standing a little further away. At the most crucial moment, Cynthia squeezed Sam's hand more firmly, and he patted her shoulder encouragingly. The introductions to his partners went even better than he thought they would. The men greeted each other and introduced themselves to the girl. We'll have something to discuss now. You go and see what's interesting, Sam said. Okay, Cynthia's voice was higher than usual. She doesn't like to go out much, Sam said quietly, watching his fake daughter walk confusedly towards the young people. She's adorable, remarked a tall, dark-haired man with glasses, looking at his mate. The hours would be like that. I might sleep better, replied the latter. The men laughed. "You can't expect any good from these kids," Sam said. He pictured Cynthia as a young sheep walking into a clearing that was already surrounded by predators ready to attack. But turning around briefly, he saw that the young people were absorbed in their phones, the light reflecting on their faces. Sam sat down in one of the vacant chairs. "Well, nice, we can relax," he thought. The meeting went well, and soon the most important but no less boring part of the presentation with the reports came to an end. The presenter received his applause for the work he had done, and the staff carried the presentation materials off the stage. Sam sighed contentedly. It was now down to the buffet. A host of waiters, in perfectly fitting press suits, crowded the room. Champagne bubbles in tall glasses played on their trays. They approached each guest. A variety of hors d'oeuvres, canapes, fruits, cheeses, and many other delicacies were brought out on the tables. Cynthia timidly approached Sam. "Champagne." The waiter leaned over her. "Oh, no, thank you. I don't drink," replied Cynthia. "Mr. Smith, how did you manage to raise such an angel?" The man with the glasses and his short companion looked at each other. "It was her mom. It's a pity she couldn't join us. If you'd seen her, you'd have realized what she was like." Sam lied. It wasn't the first time he'd lied. Otherwise, how would he have built his empire? He winked at the one with the glasses. His speech sounded so convincing that there was no doubt about the truth of his words. "You two look so much alike," one face to the other, came from behind the men. A woman's squeal sounded in the corner where the children of the other businessmen had settled. There was some excitement going on there. A waiter was hastily wiping the spilled champagne off the table. A girl in a long blue floor-length dress was reprimanding him, pointing out that this dress cost more than his annual salary, and if the champagne got on it, he would be in trouble. The girl was immediately rushed to the girl by her mother, an elegant blonde in a gorgeous gold dress. The brilliance of her outfit was overshadowed only by the diamond pendant resting regally on her chest. "Those are mine," sighed tiredly the brunette in glasses, and, draining his glass in one fell swoop, set off in the direction of the conflict. In the evening, Sam uncorked a bottle of collectible cognac saved for a special occasion. The tea-colored drink filled the plump cognac glass. The cooling stone soap cubes went there as well. Today had gone very well. Sam was extremely pleased with himself. Cynthia had done even better than he'd expected. Well, good for her. She didn't let herself get hurt, Sam thought. He remembered the first time he had met the children of rich parents. He'd been one himself. His father and mother, being big businessmen, often took him to such banquets, and he always felt like a show dog. It was hard for him to get along with his peers. All they did was to list their parents' regalia and brag about who had more expensive things. Yes, who was on what holiday in which resort. The boy had heard these identical conversations so often that they made him deathly bored. Cognac pleasantly burned his throat. The taste was great. I wonder what Cynthia is doing now, Sam thought. Sam brushed the thought away with a shake of his head. He twirled the phone in his hand and opened the contacts. Hey, do you want to come over for a visit? I think I missed you. Calculating his chances of success, he selected several women's names from the list and pressed send. He got a reply from only one girl, a searing brunette with whom he had had a brief affair a couple of years ago. Only if you're ready for something serious. And the evening could have ended differently. Sam flicked the phone away and lit a cigarette. He walked over to the window. The door slid smoothly aside. From the neighboring yard came squeals and laughter. Judging by the shouts, the family was playing snowballs. For the next meeting, Mr. Smith dressed extra carefully. The gala was to be held in one of the best restaurants in town. The premises had been fully rented for him and his partners. The man's hair was neatly styled back. A black body was around his neck, and a black tailored suit fit his figure perfectly, hiding his soft belly from prying eyes. Sam coughed and pulled back the hem of his jacket. Everything seemed perfect. He examined himself once more in the tall mirror. An executive car was waiting for him in the courtyard. The neatly dressed driver obligingly opened the door for his passenger, taking Cynthia out. The car slid gently through the city and stopped at the entrance to a restaurant with glowing lights. Sam helped the girl out of the car and, holding her under his elbow, followed the receptionist who greeted them. Cynthia, you did great. My partners are thrilled with you. They did. I was so worried. I couldn't sleep the next night. I thought they thought I was boring. I couldn't hold a conversation. Don't worry about it. All those cranky ones, like big kids, there's not much to talk about with them. If you don't know what to say, just say your dad's richer, Sam grinned. The couple entered the hall. The restaurant was decorated with a magnificent huge Christmas tree. It shone triumphantly against the floor-to-ceiling window, behind which snow was falling. On the opposite side was a grand piano at which a man in a tailcoat sat and played cozy classical music. "So well, do you know what to do?" Sam asked. Cynthia modestly said hello to everyone present and went to the Christmas tree, where some wives and children were already standing. Sam was pleased to note that Cynthia was carrying on a conversation with someone in the group. Soon she disappeared into the crowd. Apparently she went to the window. The first hour, as usual, passed in negotiations. Men settled into large leather armchairs around a mahogany coffee table and discussed the details of the deal. Some smoked cigars. Sam declined. He remembered coughing the rest of the day after the last time. No, this entertainment was definitely not for him. The conversation then turned once again to family values. The men shared their thoughts about how family represents a person as a good and reliable partner. "You are absolutely right," Sam nodded knowingly, remembering his father's many affairs on the side. If a man can keep his family together, what is business to him? Yeah. That's what we're talking about." The men nodded their heads in agreement. Finally, the business part was over and everyone was invited to the table. Cynthia looked elegant in a long black dress. The sleeves pulled back her thin arms, covering her wrists. A black velvet handbag with silver branches completed the look perfectly. Sam noted with pleasure how good she looked. He was genuinely glad that the girl would still have these beautiful and quality items. Waitresses in white gloves bustled around the tables and opened more and more dishes in front of the guests. Soon the table was filled with various delicacies. Sam occasionally caught Cynthia's questioning gaze. "What is it?" And he would say quietly in her ear whether it was worth trying or not. Soon they switched to talking only with their eyes. "We haven't been to that branch since," finished one of those present. Everyone laughed, and approving chuckles rolled across the table. Cynthia turned round, pointing at the baked snails. Sam grimaced, a look of disgust on his face. Cynthia giggled and kept looking around for something to try. Glasses clinked. The guests tasted different dishes and recalled stories from their lives, sharing their plans for the New Year's holidays. "Cynthia, how will you celebrate?" The man fixed his glasses, and the whole table stared at the girl with curiosity. "We." The girl's voice trembled from the unexpected attention. "I'll be studying for my exams." She froze, holding a piece of chocolate dessert in her hand. Sam froze when he saw a piece of jewelry slipping out from under the sleeve of her dress. A silver bracelet with thin lines of patterns glittered on her wrist. He knew that bracelet. A restless voice snapped the businessman out of his daze. Yes, you're saying all the right things. We'll stay at home. Cynthia has to study for her exams this year." "What are you studying for, Cynthia?" "Art history." "Oh, that must be very interesting." "I've been." And then Sam heard only fragments of phrases. He was immersed in his thoughts, but they didn't add up to anything coherent, just circled like kites around that bracelet. "That's impossible. I bought it myself, and then it wasn't found." He could barely wait for the meeting to end. He wanted to escape into the frosty air, to get away from the table, from the room. But etiquette confined him to his chair. As the evening drew to a close, he said goodbye to his partners and hurried away with Cynthia under his arm to bring the car round. "Cynthia, where did you get that bracelet?" "My mom gave it to me when I was a little girl. I thought it would go with the bag." The girl looked at him with a confused look. "Mum," Sam turned back to the window. "Yeah, Mum, what's wrong with him?" "Is he ugly?" "Why do you ask?" The frightened girl saw the man turn white even in the poorly lit car. "Years ago, I bought this bracelet myself. It's handmade. There's no other like it." Outside the window, the lights of houses and cars flashed by. The twinkling, bright lights of the evening city signs. Everything blended into one huge mottled kaleidoscope that threw the man back to the memories of his youth. It was as if it was no longer the streetlights, but his years flying by. Sam remembered himself with fellow students at an elite economics university. He liked higher maths. That afternoon, he was rushing to get to his pairing when he bumped into her. He almost stepped on the foot of a beautiful girl from a parallel group. As an apology, she had agreed to go with him to the pastry shop after school. What did she take then? "I think it was chocolate brownies and a milkshake." Yes, she got a little chocolate stained. The young man couldn't take his eyes off her. He looked at her angelic face and blonde hair and didn't dare to take a breath. The car pulled up in front of Cynthia's house. "Shall I go?" the girl said, or asked with slight apprehension as she opened the door. "Cynthia, I'll come round tomorrow afternoon. Will you introduce me to your mum?" "I will." Her voice sounded uncertain. Once home, Sam hurriedly pulled off her body. It seemed to tighten around his neck more and more. The tight jacket was thrown off next. It made it impossible to breathe. The man hurried to the far room. It was practically empty. Some boxes from work, blueprints, estimates were stored there. He pushed the boxes aside and discarded the scattered folders. There it was, the cherished box lay in its place. He slowly lifted the lid, his hands trembling. He carefully pushed aside a small bouquet of dried flowers, picked up the soft cloth-wrapped rectangle and gently unwrapped it. Just a few old and time-faded photographs. In one of the pictures, a young Sam in shorts and a summer shirt was holding a blonde girl by the waist against the river. There was a lump in the man's throat. He reverently placed the photo on the floor beside him. In the next photo, the girl was laughing. He took a picture of her as she was making buns. Her clothes were covered in flour. Sam grinned bitterly. He remembered how she had thrown flour at him after that picture, and they had ended up cleaning flour out of the kitchen for days. The second picture lay on top of the previous one. A single photograph remained in his trembling hands. There was no one in it. Only an empty riverbank. Tears rolled down the man's cheeks. They stung his freshly shaven face and rolled down into wrinkles. His chest felt tight. Sam could no longer be there. With holy reverence in his eyes, he folded the contents of the box back up, placed the small bouquet of flowers on the soft cloth, and put the box away. The papers lying everywhere didn't bother him. He just turned out the light and wandered into the shower. The open bottle of cognac was only too glad to be remembered. It readily burned his throat and spilled bitter venom into his chest. Tonight they didn't need an intermediary in the form of a glass. Sam took a greedy sip and choked back a cough. He sat in a terry cloth dressing gown on the living room floor. The soft carpet barely reflected the dim light of the nightlight. Sam rested his head back on the couch. There was a ringing silence in the flat. It was literally suffocating the man. He felt terribly lonely. "I'm going to die like this, and no one will notice. If only a burglar had come," he thought. "Anybody here?" he shouted into the dark corridor. "There's no one here. It's just you and me," he said to himself. Another sip. My lips stung. Sam woke up with the sun shining brightly outside his window. What he loved about expensive drinks was the lack of hangover. If he drank as much cheap cognac as he could afford in his youth, his head would be cast iron today. Already automatically, he ordered breakfast and went to perform his morning rituals. Yes, the morning routine. Just like the last 20 years on autopilot. The courier brought the breakfast. The coffee machine produced a fragrant drink, and the remnants of sleep vanished like a hand. The sunlight reflected off the fluffy snowdrifts and flooded the kitchen with light. Sam looked around as if with new eyes. How could he have neglected the house like that? The entire kitchen was cluttered with incomprehensible things. Dust lay thick wherever it could fall, and there were stains of unknown origin in front of the wide glass refrigerator. He remembered that the last time he'd had a cleaner come round at least a year ago. How time flies. Whether it was the coffee, the sun, or all of them together, a wave of enthusiasm rose in the man's soul. He wrote to the administrator of a trusted agency and called for housekeeping workers. The day promised to be a very good one. He felt that his life was about to change, and change for the better. Sam met the helpers already dressed in a woolen winter three-piece suit. He wanted to get to Cynthia's house as soon as possible. The clock was already approaching 12:00, and the journey was not a long one. He organized the work, sketched out a rough menu of what he wanted to be cooked, and left suggestions for groceries. He locked the room with the documents in advance. The frosty wind burned his face. My eyes were blinded by the bright light. The car had warmed up and was ready to pull into the driveway when the gate finally opened. Sam saw that the driveway was blocked by the maintenance crews. A pipe had burst from the frost, and men in orange uniforms, shouting at each other, and not shy in their language, were digging into the manhole, from which white steam was billowing. There was no point in arguing with fate. He couldn't outrun them. He turned the ignition key and switched off the engine. The taxi didn't arrive 40 minutes later. In that time, Sam had become quite agitated and even considered walking. His cigarettes were melting in the packet, and he tapped his fingers nervously on the armrest. Finally, the chauffeur pulled up outside the gate. Happy as a 20-year-old, Sam ran to the car and waved at the driver. "Am I crazy now?" he thought to himself. Sam jumped into the back seat and looked at his house, smiling. The huge box of brick walls seemed fake and not real to him. He didn't feel like it was his home from here, outside. It seemed to him that he was just passing by it while sitting in this taxi. Modern music was playing in the cabin, further separating Sam from this arguably lonely structure. Finally, the car moved. A snowman stood in the neighbor's yard. A few minutes later, the taxi turned onto a side road and began to pick up speed. The saloon swayed gently, and it calmed the man's nerves, taut as strings. Could it be that in half an hour he would meet her? It could have ended well, couldn't it? What if there had been a mistake then? He began to feel like his heart was going to jump out of his chest. I need to relax. Maybe find the words, Sam thought, unbuttoning his jacket. The adrenaline was making him hot. Thoughts were swirling in his head. His eyes were flooded with memories, and he was back in the period when his life was divided into before and after. Listen, this girl is no match for you. The gray-haired father sat behind the oak desk in his study. Helen's file was in front of him. He poked at it with his index finger. We'll find you a better match than this. Listen to you. His mother, who was pacing from side to side, couldn't stand it and ran over to young Sam. She collapsed beside him on the sofa, taking his hands in hers. Her voice sounded higher than usual. Listen, Sam, you're in love right now. That's understandable. But don't make any hasty decisions. Take a walk, go to the cinema, but don't plan anything serious. I'll decide what I'm going to do. The boy ripped his hands out of his mother's arms. I love her. His father tilted his head and rubbed his forehead tiredly. You don't realize you're going to ruin your whole life. She's from the orphanage. Think about it. She doesn't even know her parents' upbringing. She's young, she's beautiful. But as the years go by, she'll become rude. You need another wife around you. The older man was trying to get through to him, but he didn't realize that Sam had already made up his mind. Dad, I'm begging you, please don't get in my way. What are you talking about, Sam? Mama gasped, looking him in the eye. Dad and I only want the best for you. Listen to me, son. Before you know it, she'll be pregnant, and we raised you to be a responsible man. You're going to leave university and work to support your family, and then your whole future is wiped out. You'll end up like a loader. The man slapped the table and pointed his finger at Sam. I'll take everything away from you. No money for you until this affair's over. Mark my word. He pounded his palm on the table. His mother only pressed her lips together in agreement. Sam remembered the fury with which he had left his parents' house that evening. He had packed his things, taken Helen in his arms, and they had driven to the very outskirts of town, to a small lakeside house with a wooden floor that they had then covered with flour. Those were the best months of his life. They chatted, it seemed, 24 hours a day about everything and nothing. They had no money at all then. Helen worked part-time in the cafeteria for a few hours after school, and Sam helped out in the coffee shop at the library. It wasn't much money, but it was enough for rent and food. In their spare time, the pair crammed for their textbooks. Sam was always surprised at how much the girl knew. It seemed impossible to find her without a book. He remembered her laughing face and the bracelet. He had bought it as a gift from a jewelry shop. The bracelet was as dainty as Helen's. Sam really wished he could have given a gold one as a gift, but he barely had enough for the silver one. And then the memory took him to the river, to the very bank where he had secretly come every year on the day of her death. We're sorry, young man, but we found your friend's belongings on the shore. We believe she drowned. Her body has not yet been found. Search operations are underway. The man took off his cap. Then it had been several days since Helen had gone missing. The boy had called all her friends, but no one had seen her. She hadn't shown up at the pulpit either. Sam didn't know what to do. He went to the orphanage where the girl grew up, hoping to find her there, but she didn't come there either. Sam remembered running towards the lake. There were several police officers standing on the shore. One was writing something down. Another was carefully lifting Helen's things with tongs. He had no sooner reached the scene of the tragedy than the strong arms of a third officer wrapped around him from behind and shackled him in an iron embrace. Easy, easy, young man. You'll spoil all the evidence. We're looking for her. Sam slumped to the ground, tears welling up in his eyes. Why did she go to that lake? What could have happened? All his questions remained unanswered. The next year, Sam did not remember himself from grief. He drank. He had to take a leave of absence from school. His parents comforted their son, but they did not hide their quiet joy. It made him sick to see them. Helen's body had never been found, and that made his broken heart even more painful. Sam couldn't calm down. He had nowhere to go to visit her grave. There was no way to say goodbye. All he had left were a few pictures and the shore of the lake. Over the years, the wound in his soul never fully healed. All those fleeting romances were like a band-aid glued on a bleeding ulcer of many years. With them, his life seemed sympathetic from the outside, but he was still that wounded beast. Perhaps only with Patricia had he tried to create anything resembling a relationship. His parents liked her a lot. The girl was quiet, homemaker, but he'd never cared for that. Looking at her, he felt no emotion. It was like watching a boring TV program. He came to the conclusion that it was cruel to the girl and confessed his lack of feelings. 10 years passed, but Sam never tried to start a family again. He opened the window and sucked in fresh air. Sam tried to get rid of the heavy memories. The body had never been found, after all. So what does that make it? Could she still be alive? It could be. Could she have lost her memory? Or could she have been kidnapped? An anxious brain was throwing up new possibilities. The man didn't know if she would recognize him, but he would recognize her for sure. He realized. Cynthia did, indeed, look like Helen when she was younger. Well, yes, of course, he'd noticed that right away. Well, of course, it had to be her for sure. Sam smiled quietly, not wanting to scare off a good feeling. The car turned onto a broken road, the wheels rumbling on the gravel, scraping the unfamiliar pavement. The driver slowed down, avoiding the potholes and potholes. The snow crunched underfoot. Sam smoked a cigarette nervously. The taxi flashed its red lights and disappeared around the corner. The man was starting to freeze when the front door finally opened. Cynthia peeked out from behind it and waved at Sam, inviting him in. The cigarette butt flew into the bin, leaving a cloud of smoke. The man headed towards his destiny. "Hello, Sam." She placed the worn slippers in front of him. "How are you doing, Cynthia? Everything all right with you?" The man saw the girl's embarrassment and wanted to lighten the mood. He hung his down jacket on one of those rusty hooks in the hallway and patted her on the shoulder. The cabin seemed even smaller inside than it was outside. However, it was not without pleasure that Sam noted that it was much cozier than his home. A small kitchen opened to the right of the hallway. Cynthia invited him in and poured tea. Sam sat down on a chair covered with a colored cape. It was obvious that the hostesses had sewn it themselves. On the table was a vase of bagels and sweets. On the opposite edge of the table lay a large stack of newspapers. Cynthia had gone to fetch her mother and disappeared into the far room. Time stood still. Not knowing where to put himself, the man picked up one of the papers. There was nothing interesting in it. News, adverts, horoscopes. Folk recipes for illnesses were written in pen. Heavy footsteps sounded behind Sam. He didn't turn round. He froze. A female figure walked heavily around him, leaning her hand on the table, and sat down heavily in the chair opposite. The aroma of tea mingled with the smell of medicine. The man looked up, his eyes rounded with surprise. It wasn't her. His heart sank into his heels. In front of him sat a woman in her 50s with dark hair and swarthy skin. Her appearance was sickly and her face was drained under the onslaught of an agonizing ailment. Cynthia carefully threw a knitted shawl over the woman's shoulders. The brown eyes of the stranger regarded the man with interest, as if studying him, testing him. Hello, Sam's voice had never sounded so timid. He could barely move his lips. What else to say? He didn't know. What a stupid thing to say. Now she probably thinks I'm some kind of maniac, he thought. "Cynthia, please leave us alone, dear." The woman stroked the girl's arm affectionately. "I need to have a word with this man. You'll have to forgive me. My leg hurts terribly." The woman stretched out the sore limb in front of her. There was a wide bandage on her knee. I'm sorry. Sam struggled for words. The woman glanced down the corridor to make sure Cynthia had gone to her room. "My name is Sandra. I know who you are." I knew right away. "You two look so much alike." The woman's voice dropped to a low whisper. "I'm a friend of Helen's. I'll tell you everything that happened, but please don't say anything now." Cynthia doesn't know anything. She made herself comfortable in the armchair and poured herself some tea. "I met Helen in our village 20 years ago. She came here to work part-time. She and I shared a flat with a woman. She was a nice girl. We hit it off straight away and became friends, even though she didn't like to tell us much about herself. She was pregnant. I kept asking her where the father was, but she wouldn't tell me. I thought maybe something had happened. But maybe it's a dark story. All right, I guess it's up to you." A couple or 3 months later, she did tell me. She was living with a bloke. He was nice, she said. Smart. I loved him a lot only, she says. His parents were against it. She was no match for their son. They met her several times, demanded she disappear from his life. They even offered him money. They said she'd ruin his life and deprive him of a future. She resisted as best she could, but it only got worse. Her parents threatened her. She'd just found out she was pregnant. His parents, according to Helen, hinted that anything could happen and they wouldn't find her. And who would look for an orphan? She got scared and agreed to their terms to save the baby. So they made her pretend she'd drowned. They told her to put her own clothes on the shore of the lake. They forbade her to take anything from the house. No one realized she'd run away. They gave her some money, and then they went ahead. "So she's alive," Sam whispered, barely moving his lips. Sandra's words stabbed like sharp daggers into his shocked mind. What a fool I was. That's where their satisfied faces were coming from. They'd set it all up and watched me suffer. "So Cynthia is my daughter?" Then, yes, the woman nodded affirmatively and rubbed her sore knee. "But where is Helen? Is she alive?" "Well, honestly, I don't know. But I hope so." "How did Helen give birth?" "We'd settled down in the village for good. We worked as dairymaids. We made pillowcases to order. And then later, when Cynthia was about 2, we started going into town to work. The pay was better there. We got a job as maids, and at first it was all right. It wasn't easy work, of course, but it paid well. We left Cynthia with our landlady, Nancy. Helen paid her, of course. Well, she did a good job, and she was a woman's help. And then we were sent to a new house to clean. The owners were fighting amongst themselves. They had scandals all the time. All we could do was clean up the broken crockery. Somebody died, and they were dividing up the inheritance. Well, you could see there was a lot to divide. Cynthia came through the door. "Are you all right? Would you like some more boiling water in your tea?" "I'm fine, my dear. Go and sit in the room for a while." The woman made sure the girl was gone and leaned closer to Sam. "So I got sick one day, came down with a fever, and Helen went to see them alone. I nearly went mad. She was gone for days. No phones. And where do I call? I don't know what happened. Cynthia's crying, missing her mom, and I'm barely on the mend." She came back a few days later, but she was white as a sheet, not alone, but with a bunch of detectives. They turned the house upside down, looking for something. I went to Helen to find out what had happened. Poor thing, she was shaking like a leaf. Said she'd seen a murder happen while she was cleaning the house. The owners were arguing as usual. And then there was a scuffle, and Helen turned round to see the noise. Thought maybe they should break it up. There were 2 sons fighting, and before she knew it, one of them had shot the other in the head. She lost consciousness and came to when the police woke her up. She had the gun in her hands, and she was covered in blood. So she was framed for it. I went to court, and they pinned murder and robbing a safe on her. The safe was broken into, probably looking for jewelry. Only they didn't find anything. Her lawyer was a real scoundrel. I could tell he was bribed. Didn't defend her at all. She ended up getting 20 years. That's it. The woman rounded her eyes and splayed her hands. I didn't give Cynthia away, of course. I raised her myself. She doesn't remember Helen. She thinks I'm her mother. So Helen's in prison now. I don't know, to be honest. She wrote for the first few years. Then she disappeared. I sent her so many letters and I never heard back, as long as she was alive. I even wanted to hire a detective once. I had some money saved up, but Cynthia got sick that year. I had to splurge. The woman took Sam by the elbow to pull him out of his daze. "Sam, do you know everything now? I can see you're a decent man. I'm sure you'll want to find Helen. I only ask one thing of you." She leaned in close to the businessman's face and looked him in the eye. "When you find out anything about her, let me know. It's very important to me." Sam stood in the street and stared into the snowdrift, but saw nothing in front of him. The lit cigarette smoldered slowly in his hands, and a long column of ash fell on the snow-white snowdrift. The information he received was slowly being processed and changed his perceptions of the world upside down. His beloved had not drowned. She might be alive. He has a daughter. Covering everything seemed impossible. Walking into his house, for a second he didn't realize where he had come. The house was sparkling clean. The kitchen smelled of home-cooked food. He had already forgotten about the houseworkers, just as someone had forgotten about his Helen, who had been framed. Kicking off his boots, Sam carefully pulled a folded paper from the inside pocket of his jacket. Inside was written his first name, last name, middle name, prison number, and article. It was only a few days later that Sam found out Helen was alive. The private detective told him that she had been out 5 years ago on parole, but had stayed behind to live on a settlement. Planes didn't fly there, but you could get there by rail. The nearest train was leaving in a few days. Sam couldn't think about work anymore. Apologizing to his partners, he said he would miss all the scheduled meetings, and left it all on the shoulders of his team. Every evening, the employees sent him brief reports on how the day had gone. He was very proud of his employees. He'd managed to build a solid team after all, but they were not his real family. Sam hurried to share his joy that Helen was alive with Sandra. The woman was crying tears. Sadly, he found her in an even more pitiful state than the last time he had seen her. She had been unable to get out of bed that day. It was hard for Sam to watch her agony. He called his familiar smiling nurses from the paid clinic, and a team led by a doctor of the highest category instantly arrived. After an examination, the doctor said that surgery was necessary and that it was possible to get the woman back on her feet. Sam didn't hesitate for a minute. The same day Sandra was admitted to the clinic. The doctors took tests and set a date for the operation. Sam paid for separate accommodation. The ward was like a small flat, and Cynthia was able to sleep right with her foster mom. The girl was immensely happy and kept saying that she didn't even know how to thank him. She still didn't know the truth about her origins. So Sandra convinced Sam to hang on to the big talk and find Helen and talk to her first. It was a really good idea. Sam decided to take her advice. The train rattled its wheels melodiously. Sam hadn't been on a train in a long time. Towns and villages whizzed by outside the window. There were no neighbors. The train would arrive at the right station in the morning. From there, he would go to the settlement and meet the woman he had loved for 20 years. Outside the window, another platform flashed by and disappeared into the darkness. Sam thought, if only life were this easy one day and a bad period passed. To leave behind years of loneliness, fleeting flings, or perhaps to be the first to send into the darkness parents whose cruel love broke the lives of several people at once. The conductor knocked delicately on the first-class carriage and offered tea. Sam opened the door and was pleased to note that the drink was still served in glasses with iron-carved cup holders. Already out of habit, Sam got up at 07:00. Over the years, he didn't even need an alarm clock anymore. Soon the door of the railway station slammed behind him, and taxi drivers were trying to lure him into their cars. When he gave the address, the mustached chauffeur, whom he had picked at random from the crowd, looked back at him in surprise. He looked at him with a look of incomprehension. What was such a decent man looking for in this godforsaken place? The passenger nodded back, showing that he had not misheard him and that no explanations would follow. Sam entered Terry's cave in the settlement where they were to meet Helen. He hadn't had a chance to talk to her yet, but the woman overseeing the settlement had promised to pass on all the information to Helen and that she would meet him at the cafe. The small room was paneled in light wood on the inside, and sunlight flooded the entire space. The room smelled of sweets and coffee and milk. Sam was reminded of their first trip to the sweet shop. How long ago had it been? And he remembered it like it was yesterday. Helen had indeed been there. She was sitting at a wooden table looking out the window. She was wearing a modest beige dress with a high collar. On the back of a chair hung a simple brown jacket, unnecessarily light for this time of year. Sam froze. She's alive. It's Helen in front of me, came timidly from his lips. Sam, the woman said in a trembling voice and glanced anxiously at Sam. I don't believe it. Tears ran down her cheeks. She stood up confusedly, as if trying to believe it wasn't a dream, and held out her thin hand to him. A shadow of doubt flashed across her face, as if he were a ghost that could disappear at any false move and leave her alone again. Sam could say no more. He grabbed her into his arms and kissed her blonde hair. Happiness. The whole world disappeared for him. You haven't changed. Sam wiped the tears from her face. Helen, I know everything. I found Sandra. She told me everything. I'm so sorry. Helen, our daughter Cynthia is amazing. I know her. I came to get you. You have to come back. The woman's blue eyes filled with tears again. She picked up a white napkin from the table to wipe them away. Sam, her lips trembled. She doesn't remember me anymore. She's a grown-up girl. Why does she need a mother who's been sitting around? I've got nothing to give her. I love her so much, Sam, but I belong here now. I've spent so many years here. And outside the settlement, I'm nothing. My youth is gone. I have no education, no profession, nothing. I'm just a burden on her shoulders. Helen, it's not like that. I have everything. You won't have to work. And Cynthia, she's marvelous. She'll understand. She wants to study art history. Can you believe it? She got in on her own. Cynthia is so much like you. The woman was crying with her face down on her hands on the table. The barmaid made no sign of herself. Apparently, such scenes were not uncommon here. There were no other guests at Terry's cave. It was a difficult conversation. They talked until dark. Sam tried to persuade Helen to go with him, but she wouldn't agree. Then he decided to pull out his trump card and assured her that if she didn't go with him, he would have to move here himself to be near her and tell Cynthia everything. She would then want to come too. The words had an effect on the woman. After much thought, Helen agreed to give it a try after all. Life outside of her familiar place frightened her, but the desire to see her daughter, to see Sandra, who hadn't abandoned her child, was stronger. Helen had asked to wait for Sam at the entrance so she could gather her things, but when she came out, her thin arms were empty. Would she not go after all? But then the man saw his lover carrying a small purse over her shoulder. Helen had said she didn't want to take anything from this life into the new one. Sam liked that idea. Sure, the years were gone, but dragging a heavy load of injustice with him would be too heavy, too, in his opinion. The drive back passed in silence. The couple stared out the train window, taking the years of hardship and torment into the past. Cynthia was struck by the story of her fate. Sandra, Cynthia, and Sam sat next to the girl at the round tea table in Sam's simple living room. Sandra still had an injured leg, but the doctors had already cleared her to go home. She was making a rapid recovery. Even before the hospital conversation with Cynthia, Helen and Sam had visited the woman in the hospital. Cynthia had then been sent to the shopping center in advance to buy something for her mother, which meant that the older generation had time to discuss things amongst themselves. Sandra and Helen cried when they saw each other and hugged each other tightly. When the emotions subsided, the women decided how to tell Cynthia, and most importantly, how they would live their lives from now on. Sam suggested that they all move in with him. He thought it was a great idea. He said he had a big house with plenty of room for everyone. Cynthia would have to reinstate herself at the institute and continue her studies. The women were discouraged by the offer, but after thinking about it, they accepted it. This way Cynthia could spend time with her new parents, and Sandra, who had raised her as her own daughter, would be close by. Sam's life had changed abruptly. Just 6 months ago, he was a lonely man who had no one to take care of but his co-workers. And now he has a family, a daughter, a beloved wife, and a faithful friend. His house was filled with voices and life. It no longer go to the bank and get a loan for me. She was numbed by her mother-in-law's words. Eric is probably not that bad, he grumbled to himself. Jean froze on the doorstep of her son's apartment. Eric had been traveling for a week and had asked his mother to stop by, pick up some important documents, scan them, and send them to him. If his wife Madison had been home, he wouldn't have disturbed Jean. But Madison had gone to visit Betty's mother, whom she hadn't seen in years. Even for her daughter's wedding, Betty couldn't attend because of the predictions. Later, Betty's condition improved, but she still had a lot of time on her hands. Then her son got sick, then one thing, another. And time went by. Betty wasn't young, but she still wanted to see her daughter, who'd been living in another city for a long time. So Madison went to visit her while her husband was away on business and her son was at camp. The young woman had plenty of time to be with her relative. Forgot, damn it, he grinned. Completely slipped my mind. Slipped out, he grinned. I've been working too hard. It's a nightmare. I was going to call Madison. It slipped out that she wasn't home either. Pick it up, scan it, and mail it to me. If it's not too much trouble. I'm sorry I had to bother you like this. I didn't expect this myself. It wasn't hard for Jean to help her son. Eric has always been, is, and will always be the most important thing in a woman's life. The meaning of her existence, not otherwise, because Jean had no one else but her son. She separated from her husband when Eric was very young and has not seen him since. The husband, of course, did not pay alimony and was not interested in his son's life, which, however, was more of a plus than a minus. Jean really did not want her husband to participate in the upbringing of her boy. She was afraid that Eric would follow in his father's footsteps and grow up to be the same irresponsible and lazy freak. But fortunately, this did not happen. Eric was very sensitive and attentive, grew up a normal, kind guy, did not grab stars from the sky, but did not sit idly by. True, he couldn't get into the university, he didn't have enough points, and Jin had no money for her son's education, and there was nowhere to get it from. Eric was not too upset about it. He reassured his mother it's nothing. He grinned when Jean, almost crying, apologized to her son. The woman was ashamed that all her life she had lived almost in poverty, working 3 jobs and not seeing the light of day, and still could not give her son all the best. She didn't even have money for paid education, not to mention real estate and other things available only to the children of the rich. For someone like Eric, they were a pipe dream. But unlike his mother, he was never discouraged. Poverty didn't bother him at all. Small is not small, he used to say. And about education, Eric considered it pointless, Mom. But who sits in these universities now? He pondered, convincing Jean. Who needs it? You're right, only rich kids have time to sit around for 5 years. I, for example, do not have such time. And I'm not interested in it. After school, Eric went straight to work. He was not taken into the army for health reasons. And it was as if a stone had fallen from Jean's shoulders. Thank God, son. I was so worried, she wailed. What else could she do? Her only son, her own blood. And there would never be another. And no one could bring him back if anything happened. Until then, Eric's fate was quite favorable, which could not but please his mother. Eric grew from a bartender to a restaurant manager and began to receive a fairly decent salary. As soon as his career became certain, Eric thought about starting a family, which caused a storm of emotions and worries in Jean. The future daughter-in-law did not impress the woman properly. Why do you need a country girl, son? Her mother wailed when Eric walked his Madison home after the formal family dinner. She's even younger than you, and she doesn't even know where she came from. I don't know what kind of person she is. In short, she's kind of suspicious. At least that's what I thought. Mom, I didn't grow up in a palace. Either Eric laughed, surprised that his mother was so concerned about Madison's background. And we got the apartment from my grandmother. Just lucky. We were born here. And she's a long way from the metropolis. But that doesn't mean she's any worse than you or me. We have something in common: poverty. Madison is very hardworking and strives for a better life. I'm sure she and I will have a strong family. Eric met his future wife in the same restaurant where he worked. Madison immediately appealed to him. Such a purposeful and active girl could not remain without the attention of the young manager. Therefore, their relationship developed rapidly, as far as possible. This could not help but embarrass Jean, who was shocked when her son told her that he had known Madison for only a few months. So, you're going to marry her already? She exclaimed. You've known a girl for a week and you're ready to drag her to the registry office? You should at least find out who her parents are, what they're like. What if they're alcoholics or worse? I'll have good grandchildren, I can't tell you that. I've dreamed of grandchildren like that my whole life. Madison didn't like to talk about her family. Every time Eric tried to start a conversation about it, she changed the subject. He understood that there was no telling what she might be going through. After all, he wasn't going to marry her relatives. He was going to marry her. Blinded by love, Eric thought Madison was the perfect girl of his dreams: beautiful, smart, determined. He didn't need another bride. He paid no attention to his mother's words. A few weeks after he proposed to Madison, the chief told Eric about his new career prospects. I'm going to be expanding my network. John Smith shared his plans. I think you could help me with that. You've been working for me for so many years, serving me faithfully, so to speak. You can be trusted by me and my institution. So I have an offer I'm sure you won't refuse. Let's talk about it. If you don't mind, of course. I wouldn't want to postpone such important matters. How could you think that? Eric grinned. You know I'm always in favor, especially when it comes to work. That's good, smiled John Smith. Then come to my office in an hour and we'll talk and discuss further plans. Eric was happy when the chief informed him that he wanted to make him his confidant. At last he would have the job he had always dreamed of: traveling, negotiating, looking for places to open new locations in other cities. An amazingly interesting and busy life, and most importantly, a very decent salary. Of course, John Smith promised Eric a substantial fee. It's not just sitting in one restaurant. Compensation for the trouble must be motivating. Well, the chief winked. So we've agreed on everything? Of course, Eric nodded. You have no idea how timely this is. Eric was just about to get married. He needed the money now. He needs to get an apartment. Madison and I weren't going to cramp my mom. That's the right thing to do, Eric reasoned. But I'd be careful with that girl if I were you. Well, so would you, sighed Eric, who didn't understand how Madison could be disliked. She was so wonderful, so amazing. And his mother's attitude toward her potential daughter-in-law was something Eric could understand. Jean was just jealous of her only son. She was afraid that once he married her, he'd drift away from her. At first, he would visit occasionally, then communication would be limited to phone calls, and eventually they would become a luxury. The woman was just worried that she would be all alone. After all, she had no one but Eric. But what could be confusing in a girl with whom he did not even know? No one. Eric sincerely did not understand, so he did not develop this topic too much. He felt it necessary to ask carefully why Madison suddenly aroused such antipathy in him. Well, I've been around for a while and I've seen a lot of different people, he said meaningfully. I've learned to understand them. And I'll tell you something, Madison. Your girlfriend is very complicated. She never does anything for nothing. I'm guessing you're going to say. What's in it for her with me? If she wanted a favorable arrangement, she would have found herself some millionaire who sprinkled her with gold and the best resorts in the world took her. But if she's with you, then there is a benefit. And then it's a benefit. And then it's up to you to figure it out. As they say, you can't use your own head. Eric didn't take the words seriously at the time. Madison was too precious to him to look for flaws in her. And the girl didn't look like a cunning predator who came to megacities in packs every day in search of a better life. But it seemed so only at first glance. People with experience saw right through Madison, but not Eric. He was too naive and well-mannered. He'd spent his whole life riding up his mom's coattails. He grew up poor, but he was cared for and loved. He just couldn't see the bad in people. Madison didn't even know what Madison was after. Although the girl was indeed not a miss, but showed herself in all her glory much later, which left a deep wound on Eric's heart, which, as it seemed to him, will never heal. And everything had started out so well: wedding rings, traveling, buying an apartment, and plans for the near future. The moment Eric married Madison, he thought he was the happiest man in the world. Even Jean, who was quite skeptical of her son's family life, couldn't spoil his mood. Eric was elated and hoped that in the very near future his wife would give him a baby boy. It was time for him to become a father, and he didn't want to postpone this important event. Only Madison didn't show much initiative. To be more precise, she wasn't going to have a baby at all, and did everything she could to avoid getting pregnant. But she didn't tell Eric about it, of course. With all her might, the girl pretended that, just like him, worried about the lack of heirs. Allegedly ran to doctors, each of whom said the same thing, which Madison then, with a sigh, recounted to Eric. And he believed her and waited patiently for the moment when all the problems would be resolved. Eric didn't even realize that would never happen, because there were no problems. Madison couldn't stand children. She was allergic to infant crying and screaming. She herself had grown up in a large family, and instead of reading books, going out with friends, and doing useful things for herself, Madison had to babysit the younger ones her mother gave birth to. When Betty learned that her daughter had made a good deal, she was happy for her, but reminded her of the younger children, "Don't forget to send us some money. Just a little bit, but at least something. Rachel's shoes are worn out, and Anthony needs to get ready for school. You know, I don't make that much," Madison thought to herself indignantly. "Did I really give birth so I could work for all of you?" She married out of a peculiar calculation. Initially, Madison realized that Eric could not provide her with a rich and luxurious life. But he had something important. He genuinely loved Madison and would do anything for her. Besides, Eric was a local resident and had his own apartment. He was a very favorable candidate for Madison, and it would be foolish to pass him up. If she married some fat rich man, she would be enslaved, and her whole life would be reduced to satisfying the whims of an old rich man. That was not Madison's plan at all. After the wedding, she was able to quit her demanding job and stay home. Eric hoped that Madison was about to give him a baby boy, and then a second and third child. He wanted a large and strong large family, so he decided that Madison would take care of the house, the nest, and household issues. When buying an apartment, Eric did not skimp, took a large and spacious. This really upset Jean, who hated her daughter-in-law, but hoped that the young people would live with her. The apartment needed renovation, and she expected the newlyweds to do it. However, Eric wanted to live separately with his wife and hoped that his mother would understand him. "Mom, we cannot live with you under the same roof. You don't like Madison and are against our relationship. Sooner or later there will be conflict, and I don't want that. Besides, we want lots of kids. And you're not old enough, you need a vacation, not a baby crying at night." And so it was, only Jean was very afraid for her son and did not trust Madison. And as it turned out, with good reason. About a year after the wedding, the daughter-in-law never gave her son the long-awaited heir. Mother-in-law increasingly often asked uncomfortable questions how and why. All this very annoyed Madison, who steadily drank birth control pills and prayed not to get pregnant. But contraception failed her. Madison went to great lengths to feign joy when Eric guessed she was pregnant because of her recent poor health. Until recently, Madison hadn't believed she was knocked up, writing it off as overwork. But when she discovered the delay, she was horrified to realize that she couldn't escape her fate. Termination of pregnancy was out of the question. Eric would have realized everything and divorced her. She had no choice. She had to register and pretend to be happy. "How long have I waited for this?" exclaimed Eric over the moon. Finally, the dream has come true. The long-awaited baby is about to be born. From this moment on, Madison and I will begin a new beginning in our relationship. Throughout her pregnancy, Madison had been feeling very ill, which made her disgusted mood even worse. "Damn this pregnancy," she resented, complaining to her mother about feeling sick. "May it all burn blue. I hate it. That's what these modern methods led to. Now my whole life is down the drain. I don't know what I'm going to do. I have no experience. This baby will be born soon, and I'll have to take care of it around the clock." Betty was horrified by her daughter's words. She hoped that these emotions were temporary and would pass soon. "Are you out of your mind, Madison?" she wailed. "Children, this is happiness. And there's no escape. You married a townie with an apartment, and now you're working your ass off. What else can I tell you?" Betty didn't attend her daughter's wedding. Madison asked her not to come. "But you realize that bringing all these people here, Rachel and Tyler, is going to raise questions," Madison reasoned. "It's not good for me, you know. Eric's mom can't stand me. And if she finds out I have a large family, it'll be the end of me. But it doesn't matter to you. You can look at the pictures later. And it's not going to be anything special. It's just a celebration with all the trimmings." Betty didn't have anyone to leave the kids with. So there was some truth to what her daughter said. And she didn't want to ruin Madison's personal life. Her future depended on it. Rachel and Tyler are no strangers to family. Madison did send money. And after she started dating Eric, the amount even increased a little. At that time, still future husband always gave her beloved pocket money, and she sent them to the family. Betty could not be happy, finally bought normal shoes for her brother and sister, clothes. "Thank you, my daughter," she wailed, almost crying. "Thank you for not forgetting your family. I don't know how to thank you." Madison wasn't doing all this for her mother, her brother and sister, but for herself. If it were up to her, she wouldn't give a dime to her family. But the girl was not ready to listen to the regular reproaches of her mother. So she gave Betty a little money for poverty, just so that she would not bother. And so it went on until the birth. With the birth of the child, Madison planned to change the established order and perhaps remove the mother from the maintenance, if because of her lies would not fall into a trap. After that, there was no way Madison was going to be without her mother's help. Although who would have thought that things would turn out this way? They say old love never rusts. Only in Madison's case, it wasn't love, it was entertainment. But still, it was better than nothing at all. After the arrival of his son, Eric worked even harder. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? The happy father tried hard for the sake of his son's bright future, so that the boy by adulthood had an apartment, a car, and a good education. And Eric did not plan to stop there. As soon as Braden was born, he immediately started talking about a second child. But Madison had given herself her word that this was the first and last birth of her life, never again. She vowed to herself as she looked in the hospital restroom mirror. Eric was bouncing with happiness and delight, and Madison struggled to bring herself to hold her son to her chest. Her whole body ached. She struggled to move her legs and cursed the contraception that had failed her. "Doctor, do whatever you want," Madison begged when she finally managed to talk to a doctor. For a few days after the birth, the world revolved around little Braden, and no one cared about Madison's suffering. At least that's how it seemed to her. Deep down, she hated her son. The boy caused Madison absolutely no feelings or emotions other than disgust. "God, how awful this is," she muttered to herself under her breath, trying to get away from the difficult labor. She couldn't imagine how she had survived it all. However, after a while, Madison thanked fate for the fact that the birth of her son was given to her so hard. It turned out that because of several mistakes made by the obstetrician and the complexity of the whole process, she is unlikely to ever become a mother again. "You know, it happens," the doctor sighed regretfully. She had no idea how happy Madison was to hear those words. Of course, there was no 100% guarantee, and the girl planned to keep taking the pills. But it was at least something. She definitely wouldn't be able to take it again. It was so awful that Madison didn't even want to remember it. She asked the doctor not to say anything to her husband yet. She didn't know how Eric would react to the fact that this was likely to be the first and last time he became a father. He could get angry or make a scene and blame the doctors. Madison didn't want that, especially since the doctor wasn't saying anything definitive. "Time will tell," she reasoned. "We'll live to see. Maybe I'm being overdramatic, but I just couldn't not tell you." Madison really hoped the doctor's prognosis would come true. There has to be a holiday on my street after all. I should be able to breathe easy and free. I deserve it. Especially since the role of a mother of many children the girl has never enticed. Life at the ready, this is yes, but to reproduce like a rabbit, definitely not. It's not my thing. So Madison was convinced that Eric should have tempered his ardor. But since he was not ready for it, the circumstances were very much to the girl's advantage. Madison was only involved in her son's upbringing partly. To throw off her shoulders part of the responsibilities, she was even willing to tolerate her mother-in-law, who was genuinely happy about the birth of a grandson and regularly came to help her daughter-in-law with the child. Eric even offered his mother to temporarily move in with them. "Well, why should you travel?" he reasoned. "Constantly have to travel. And so you get up and do as much as you like. Why not? Especially since your relationship with Madison seems to be on the mend. You're not even criticizing her as much lately as you used to." Jean just didn't want to upset her son. He would surely make excuses for his out-of-touch wife, such as saying that she was still young and inexperienced, so she didn't know how to take care of a child. Eric would never admit that Madison was a bad mother who didn't care about her son. A veil of happiness was covering his eyes, and the man just didn't see it. Jean, on the other hand, saw it all. She had a keen eye for such things. You can't fool an experienced woman. Madison had it all written all over her face. Just a glance and everything became clear at once. Only a lovesick and happy fool like Eric could ignore such obvious things. But that came with time. Jean was sure that sooner or later her son and daughter-in-law's relationship would crack. They were two different worlds. If Eric was a model family man, an honest, decent man, Madison was clearly a man of her own mind, and her soul was black. And someday Eric would see that, just so it wasn't too late. Jean didn't want to think about it. Such thoughts depressed her. Since Braden's birth, all her attention had been focused on her grandson. What happened to Madison was no longer of any importance to her. She wasn't helping her daughter-in-law, but her son, who was struggling to provide a decent living for his family. But despite the fact that Jean stopped reacting to Madison like a bull to a red rag, she absolutely refused to move in with him. She did not change her attitude toward her daughter-in-law and did not want to live with her under the same roof. Eric understood his mother's decision and did not insist. He was very grateful for her help. It can be considered that Braden grew up in the arms of Jean, who did everything that depended on her to ensure that her grandson had a prosperous childhood. When the child grew up, the woman often took him to visit her. Madison was all for it. The less time she had to spend on the child, the better. She had the opportunity to spend those hours on herself. And what could be better than a break from all that work? And her soul was begging for a break. And Madison saw her son as just that, a burden. She was very tired of him and could hardly hide her emotions from her husband, who, as it seemed to her, had completely withdrawn because of constant employment at work. And if he worked for his wife's wants and needs, Madison would not even say a word to him. But Eric wouldn't let her spend any extra money, saving it all for the future. Even to send some money to Betty, Madison had to save the money she'd been given by her husband and find a way. She hardly ever went into the details of her family's life. Meanwhile, her brother and sister were growing up and demanding more and more from their mother every day. They needed money for this, that, and the 10th. Once Betty hinted to her daughter that it would be a good idea to help with Rachel and Tyler's future, to which she said nothing and walked away from the conversation. "Let's not look that far ahead," Madison replied meaningfully to her mother. "When you asked if I could drag my brother and sister to the big city afterward, they're too young to talk about it. When they grow up, when they decide what their future plans are, then we'll talk about it." Madison thought to herself that no one had ever gotten her anywhere or helped her in any way, and for some reason she had to do it again. Or not again, but again. And then Greg showed up if he wasn't laden. He fell on Madison's head like a snowball and brought confusion into her relatively peaceful and trouble-free life. When the former lover, whom Madison dated in her distant youth, wrote to her on social media, she didn't even believe it at first. How did he find her? He'd been looking for her with a purpose. Recently, Greg more and more often remembered his first love. His personal life did not work out, his career did not work out either. And so Gregory was more and more often immersed in the memories of the distant past. Word of mouth got around and they agreed to meet. Madison decided why not. She hadn't even realized that Greg had moved to the big city, too. And it was the one she lived in. After all, they hadn't spoken in years. And this meeting was something she'd wanted at first purely out of curiosity. Madison wondered how the former beau was doing. But after a while she realized that Greg could be a good entertainment for her. Her husband was constantly missing on his business trips, all the money he made. The son was almost constantly in the care of Jean, who loved her grandson very much. And since her mother-in-law considered Madison a bad mother, she tried as little as possible to give her the opportunity to spend time with her son. And the daughter-in-law was only too glad. There was more than enough time to cheat on her spouse, so she didn't hesitate. Just a few weeks after meeting Greg, she got involved with him. They met in a small rented apartment, in which the young man lived alone for several years. Madison hadn't even considered hiding, just took and left to her lover, dumping her son to her mother-in-law. And the mother-in-law hadn't asked her daughter-in-law any questions in a long time. Yes, and suspicions of Madison's behavior would not have caused Jean, if at some point daughter-in-law did not cross the line. "When are you going to invite me to your house?" Greg, to whom Madison had foolishly promised to invite him to visit, asked. She said that when Eric was on a business trip, she would invite Greg. Madison said I'd like to spend time in a normal apartment, not this dump. Greg didn't have money for rent or a hotel. He made an average salary. He lived better than he did in his hometown, but not luxurious. Greg wasn't about to splurge to spend time with a girl he'd once dated behind the garages. It would be too much for him. No amount of love for Madison would make him change his mind. I'll definitely invite you, Madison waved him off. Only you'll be my former classmate, nothing more. Got it. What, Eric might suddenly come back, Greg grinned. Then maybe we shouldn't take any chances. No, it's not that. Madison sighed, knowing her mother-in-law had the keys. The girl's act was as stupid as possible. Anyone else in her position would never have gotten involved in such a venture. But that day, when she and Greg had spontaneously secluded themselves in the marital bedroom, there was no sign of trouble. Eric was on a business trip. The son was at camp. Who would have thought her husband would forget the paperwork he so suddenly needed at home? Madison didn't even hear the door open. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, knew what was going on right away. It was hard not to guess from the sounds coming from the room. Jean was furious. She was ready to burst into the room and kick her daughter-in-law out of the house. But she found the strength to calm down and look at the situation sensibly. It didn't take much intelligence to cause a scandal and destroy her son's family. Except that Eric would never forgive it. Jean knew that. So she decided to make the best of the situation for herself and her son. Instead of barging into the room where her daughter-in-law was having fun with her lover, Jean lurked in the kitchen. Madison and Greg would have come here sooner or later anyway. And that's when Jean would have a frank talk with her sister-in-law. It happened faster than the woman would have guessed. No sooner had her mother-in-law made tea than she heard footsteps in the hallway, and a moment later, curses pouring from her sister-in-law's mouth. "Oh, shit," Madison exclaimed when she saw her mother-in-law's boots in the hallway. Damn, disbelievingly forgot I hadn't locked the secret door. That's why Jean was able to open the door with her key. How could I?" Continued Madison's indignation, who was so confused she didn't know what to do next. Her thoughts were confused and she was overwhelmed with shame. The girl walked to the kitchen where her mother-in-law was sitting and drinking tea. Madison could not immediately find the right words to start a conversation. She realized that in the best case she would face a scandal and divorce. And at worst, it was scary to imagine what someone like Jean could do for the sake of her son. She will stop at nothing to avenge his suffering. That's why her mother-in-law's proposal sounded unexpected. For a few minutes, she speculated about Eric's feelings and what such a situation might lead to. When Greg appeared in the doorway, the mother-in-law demanded that he leave. "You weren't called here," she exclaimed. "No shame, no conscience. Not only are you sleeping with another man's wife, you're interfering in the conversation." "Greg, you really should leave now," Madison muttered, confused. "Wait for me in my room, I'll talk to you in a minute. And then we'll pack up and leave together." The grief-stricken lover had nothing to do but obey. He was no less confused than Madison, because he had not expected it to turn out this way. Greg imagined what problems awaited his friend in life, and he didn't want to be a part of them. Madison was ready for everything, except for the fact that her mother-in-law would be so cynical about the situation and demand money for her silence. "So, that's it?" the mother-in-law said, looking Madison intently in the eye. Jean's tone did not bode well. So the girl froze, waiting to hear what she was so afraid of. And after all, divorce was not part of her plans at all. Next to Eric, Madison lived quite freely. He was constantly working, and despite the fact that he saved most of the money, still provided her with quite a comfortable life. Her mother-in-law took care of her son most of the time. It was a dream life, and Madison was in danger of losing it all. But she did. In return for her silence, her mother-in-law demanded a large sum of money, which Madison had no place to get. "If you want to have fun," Jean said. "As they say, bad things are easy, and you are not capable of anything else in this life. But my son mustn't suffer. If he did something stupid by getting involved with you, then my Eric doesn't have to be responsible for all your shenanigans. And I'm prepared to keep your affair from him. It will avoid a scandal and save your marriage. But in return, you'll owe me something. And don't take too long. I need the money as soon as possible. If I don't get it, I'll tell my son. Then you can kiss this apartment and your carefree life goodbye. And considering that you haven't worked or done anything for years, it's not hard to guess that you'll be left with nothing. You'll go back to the country where you belong. Madison guessed why her mother-in-law needed such a large sum of money, but she didn't dare to say it. Where would I get that kind of money? She mumbled confusedly. You know I don't have a penny. Eric handles all the finances in our family. Maybe you should ask him. Her mother-in-law laughed. Jean didn't know how to react to her daughter-in-law's absurd suggestion. If she could ask her son for money, she would definitely do it. And she had already tried many times. Mom, well, understand you, but I cannot invest such a large amount of money to repair your apartment. Justified the son. You know Madison and I have a baby. I'm saving every penny I can to buy another place to live. I have to think about my son's future, and by the way, your grandsons. You love Braden too, don't you? We should have sold the old place a long time ago. It's more profitable than fixing it up. You're not a stupid woman. You know that. And frankly, I'm amazed at your persistence. Jean would be happy to sell the apartment, but could not, because her late mother strictly forbade her to do so. When Alexander was alive, Georgia gave her daughter her word that she would never leave her inheritance in the hands of strangers. You see, this apartment is the whole meaning of my life with my father, said the woman. It was inherited from my late mother and must pass from generation to generation, while remaining in our family. It has a special energy, and the apartment itself is special. You just don't realize it yet, but in time you will. Jin really didn't understand. Her late mother's words were still a mystery to her to this day. What were these features of the inherited apartment that her mother was talking about? What was so special about it? And why Alexandra Georgia so did not want the dwelling to ever end up in the wrong hands? For the modern world, her desire was wild. Selling old apartments and buying new ones had long since become commonplace, and it was at least strange to cling to a property whose walls were about to fall off. But Jean had to do it. Since Jean could no longer live with the encroaching mold in the kitchen, bathroom, and wallpaper yellowed from dilapidation, she had to get the money for repairs somewhere. Jean even tried to take out a loan, but was turned down. Apparently the income is very small, she sighed to herself when she got home from the bank. And the age is not the same. The amount is large. Apparently they're afraid that I'll die and won't pay it back. Bastards. And Eric, on principle, did not want to spend on this junk. He bought a new home, and his mother's apartment was not needed for nothing. Just because Jean didn't want to sell it wasn't his problem. And it didn't mean Eric had to shell out the money to fix it up. The woman wasn't going to sit idly by. And the way things had turned out, it was the perfect excuse to get the money she needed. Jean had no doubt that her sister-in-law would get the money. People like her dig with their noses. But they'll get their way. Go to the bank, get a loan, she said, breaking the silence between them. I don't care. And at the same time to get a job, because not bad so settled on the neck of my Eric. You don't work, you don't raise your son? The boy's with me all the time. You will start to do something, if of course you want to keep the family. Finishing her tea, her mother-in-law declined, and Madison returned to her lover Greg's room, who by now was sitting fully clothed on the bed, perplexed. No, well, did you hear that? Exclaimed the girl indignantly. What an insolent woman. It's just lawlessness. And after all, always from herself so good and decent built, but in fact unscrupulous and unprincipled. A blackmailer. What am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to get such money? Should I steal it? This is out of the question. It's a nightmare. Greg didn't understand what was being said, as he hadn't heard Madison's conversation with her mother-in-law. But when his mistress brought him up to speed, the man had a plan, and a very cruel one at that, listening to which even Madison with her cynicism was a little confused. "Don't be in a hurry to refuse," Greg said. "You'd better think about my offer. We'll kill a lot of birds with one stone. We'll give your mother-in-law money for repairs, and you can leave your husband at any time. That's what you want, isn't it? If you didn't want a baby, you'd be hanging out with me right now." No, divorcing Eric and marrying Greg were not in Madison's plans at all. She was happy with the status quo: one man for life, another for bed. It was the way many married women lived, and she was no exception. Madison didn't want to get involved in such a risky venture with her lover, but only until she realized with horror that she had no choice but to heed Greg's advice and put his plan into action. Turning to credit organizations was absurd. Who would give a loan to someone who was unemployed? A quick and easy way to make money was the only way Madison could solve her problem, and after a few days she realized that she simply had no other choice but to accept. "What are you so worried about?" Greg reassured his mistress. "You don't even have to do anything. I'll do everything myself. You, most importantly, agreed with your mom. Will she agree to help you?" "Of course she will," Madison sighed. "Where's she supposed to go?" On that fateful day, Jean was walking with Braden on the playground, as usual. Before she knew it, the poor woman had been hit on the head with something heavy. It was early in the morning, so there were no witnesses to the incident. As soon as Jean woke up, she immediately ran to look for her grandson. But the boy was nowhere to be found, and naturally no one had seen or heard anything. Braden liked to walk early in the morning. He was generally a very active and mobile child. He got up at dawn and went to bed very late. In a word, restless. And now he's gone. "God, how can I look into my son's eyes?" sobbed Jean, sitting in the police station, where she went as soon as she realized that her own efforts to find her grandson will not lead to any results. "You could use some help yourself," the investigator told her. "Preferably medical help. Why didn't you call an ambulance? How long have you been lying in the street on the damp ground? You have a very serious head injury. You can't let this go unaddressed." "What the hell kind of ambulance? Hit and run? Jean, are you kidding me? Don't you get it? My grandson's missing. My only grandson. And you and your doctors." Jean had to go to the hospital, but she refused to be hospitalized. She was in a hurry to see her daughter-in-law. Jean didn't know how to tell Eric what had happened, and she wanted to put Madison in charge. And at that moment, her mother-in-law didn't even realize that her daughter-in-law might have been involved in all of this. It was only when she arrived at Madison's house and found her sobbing over a note demanding a substantial ransom that she realized what was going on. At that moment, Jean was overcome with fear and her chest pinched with guilt. "And damn it," said the poor woman, "how the hell did I not realize it at once?" That's how she decided to get the money. If I hadn't asked for it, Braden would have been all right. But Madison had no proof that her mother-in-law had anything to do with it, and she could hardly keep from hurling accusations at her. Eric was due back from another business trip any day now, and Jean was afraid to imagine what would happen when he found out. Madison was hysterical, smearing mascara on her face from her tear-stained eyes, wailing, wondering what to do next. "We have to call Eric right away," she insisted. "We can't wait, and what if they do something to the baby in the meantime? Tell him to come back from his business trip immediately. We have to pay, or I risk losing my son. We can't let that happen." Jean insisted on waiting for Eric to return. "The police are in charge of this case," she argued. "There's no way we can pay the ransom. Maybe the police could find something, get a lead on something. After all, we weren't walking in a field. We were in a playground in the middle of apartment buildings. Somebody must have seen us. Right? The cops have already started a search." Wait to see if there's any news. But Madison needed a ransom, so she played out another terrifying episode. Greg called her on Messenger at his mistress's request, and showing her a video of a bound Braden, mouth taped shut, rambling menacingly. "No police. If you report anywhere, I'll finish the kid. Bring the money tomorrow." "I've got the address." "That's it. Come on, why?" It was impossible to recognize the man. He was dressed all in black, wearing a mask with slits for eyes. Greg's voice had been altered by a computer program. Immediately after the call, Madison continued her feigned hysteria. "Don't you see?" she sobbed. "They know everything about us. They know everything about us. We have to call Eric right now. There's no other way out. We have to give them the money, or Braden's dead." Madison frantically dialed her husband's number and told him everything, and Eric left everything to rush into town. On the way, he contacted Anthony Adams and, stammering, explained the situation. The chief immediately suspected something wrong and asked him not to do anything until he arrived. "Don't you understand?" Anthony Adams asked, looking at Eric trembling with fear. "Is everything here sewn up with white threads?" Anthony Adams arrived at Eric's apartment before the man could even get up. Anthony Adams, like Jean, knew what was going on. Eric, on the other hand, didn't realize what he was supposed to realize. "I sense that your wife is not the only one involved," Anthony Adams said openly, and was immediately confronted with a wave of indignation. "What are you talking about?" Eric was outraged. "How could you? What does Madison have to do with this? Aren't you saying that she organized the kidnapping of her own son?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Anthony nodded. "I've been doing some digging into her background, and I want to tell you that I found a lot of interesting things. I'll give it to you sometime. You can read it at your leisure." At that moment, Eric was hardly aware of reality and was completely unable to adequately perceive any information, especially that concerning his wife. It seemed to him that Anthony was delusional and would take back his words at the first opportunity. But Anthony Adams wasn't going to do that. "If you don't mind, I'm going up with you," he said. "I'm sure it would be best if we could work this out together, especially since you can hardly do without my help." And Eric didn't care. Not at all. The only thing he cared about at that moment was where his son was and what about him. As they sobbed uncontrollably, Madison handed her husband a ransom note and told him about the kidnapper's call. Anthony Adams confirmed his suspicions. Jean remained silent. She could see how depressed her son was, who was ready to run to the bank to order the necessary amount of money. "We'll pay," Eric said firmly. "As much as they say, just to get Braden back. I have one son and I don't need him. And money is nothing. I'll make more money." When he found out the mother had gone to the police, he was very angry. "Why did you do it?" Eric exclaimed. "Who asked you to do that? You have to go and get your statement now. Don't you understand? They could kill Braden. Or don't you care how you got that idea?" "I did it before I knew about the visitor's note," Jean muttered confusedly. "But if you insist, which is fine, I'll take back my statement now. I'll say that Braden was found, ran away, lost. He was picked up by some random passerby walking his dog. And he's home now, and he's home now, and he's perfectly fine." "So stop." Anthony Adams intervened in the conversation, who was beginning to be annoyed by this circus. "Nobody's going anywhere. That's clear. We'll give the money to them, get Braden back, and then we'll figure out what's what." The man was a man of action, and as soon as he and Eric went to the bank, he offered to plant counterfeit money on the kidnappers. "I printed a whole bunch of them," once he laughed, "just for laughs and to test my skills. The bills were in the safe, and I never used them. But it turned out to be useful. Who knew?" Eric was not laughing at that moment, and he sincerely did not understand what Anthony was so happy. "Your crazy idea, of course I refuse," said the man. "I have one son. And God forbid anything should happen to him. No one will give him back to me. So no such jokes. We'll go to the bank right now. I'll order the money, and then we'll take it to where the kidnappers said. They're going to give me my Braden back. I don't believe it, sighed Anthony Adams, who had no intention of backing down. Anthony continued to convince Eric to do what he had in mind. Anthony Adams was confident that Braden was in no danger. Do you want me to contact a man who can find your son in a matter of hours? He offered. You sure you can do that? You want me to promise you the boy will be fine. Anthony Adams knew Madison's background. His mom and his brother and sister. He knew that's where Braden had been taken. There was nowhere else to go. It was unlikely Madison had hired some professional thugs to keep the kid in a dark basement. The mother was in total need of money, so it was highly likely she would have agreed to this adventure, knowing that Eric was willing to do absolutely anything for her son's sake. Let's go for a ride, Anthony Adams suggested. What have we got to lose? Let's go and see what's going on. If Braden isn't there, well, then we'll figure out what to do next. But I'm pretty sure your wife took the boy to his mother, who also decided to make a quick and easy buck and help her daughter stage the kidnapping. Eric didn't want to believe any of this nonsense. He couldn't believe that his wife was capable of such a thing. The man refused until the last, justifying himself by saying that he did not want to risk the life and health of his son. But in the end, Anthony Adams managed to persuade him. All right, let's go, he agreed. Only if something happens to my son. You do realize that if your assumptions are wrong, I could lose my child. Yes, I understand everything. Anthony Adams waved away, who was absolutely certain he was right. He had already contacted his security chief. My boys are coming with us, the man said. We'll pick them up now. Eric couldn't believe this was all happening to him. It wasn't until they actually found Braden at Betty's that the man had to face the harsh reality. Bursting into a small apartment located in a cottage, Anthony Adams and his guys immediately took the woman in a turn. And she didn't hide her grandson at all. The daughter asked me to help, so she did. But is that a crime, the woman wondered. I'm Braden's grandmother, and he can stay with me. As unfortunate as it was, Madison could indeed get away with it. Unless, of course, it could be proven that Greg had demanded the money from Eric. Anthony Adams had been too heavy-handed and head-on. After the father and his boss had taken Braden away from Betty, the woman had called her daughter immediately. Ladies, whispered Madison, who had no choice but to run out into the stairwell. When she saw her mother's cell phone number pop up on the screen, I'm listening to you. What's wrong? Quit your adventure, Betty whispered. Her husband just arrived with some men. I don't know how they got my address and guessed I had Braden, but they took your son. God, Madison, why did I even get involved in this? I mean, we could go to jail. What about the kids? Do you have any idea what's going to happen to them? Your Greg's idea was completely absurd. You're on your own now. Betty agreed to help her daughter just for the money. Madison had promised a substantial sum of money for her to take Braden in for a while. What are you guys up to? The woman asked excitedly. Why would you drag a baby all the way out here? A several-hour car ride. Mommy, it's the way it has to be, Madison replied. Can't you just help me? Madison didn't go into details. She only told me briefly, assuring me that everything would be okay. And that's how it turned out. Her mother knew about her daughter's relationship with Greg and didn't understand her at all. It would have been fine if you'd traded your Eric for some wealthy man, the woman reasoned. But who did you get involved with? That beggarly bastard. He was a fool, and he's still a fool. No good will ever come of him. So you're wasting your time with your husband. If he finds out, it'll be bad for you and your son. Madison was less interested in Braden's fate than in her own well-being. When her mother had told her that their whole adventure had been discovered, Madison had been terrified. What's going to happen now? Madison lamented. She contacted Greg. Would Eric put me with his son? Don't worry about it, grinned the grief-stricken lover, who had no doubt they'd get away with it. They'll never prove anything in their lives. So they ran your address, got your background, found Braden. So you went to your grandmother's house. What's the big deal? You won't get the money, which means you won't be able to pay off your mother-in-law. What mother-in-law? Madison was furious. What are you talking about? Eric's going to divorce me anyway. It's over. How can you not see that? There was no doubt about it. Eric came home very angry and, without even saying hello, asked his mother to take Braden for a walk while he talked to his wife. Anthony Adams did not accompany him, thinking it would be embarrassing already. Well, he smiled. I'm glad you've finally seen the light. I warned you, and as you can see, my intuition was right. Good luck to you. I'll see you at work. Me and the guys are going on vacation. Madison could tell by the look on Eric's face that nothing good was in store for her. She'd never seen her husband so angry. Well, he said, looking intently into his wife's eyes, let's not put our conversation on hold. Eric literally flooded Madison with questions about the family and everything else, but most importantly, about Braden. How could you? He wondered. He's your son. He's not just mine, he's yours. And you. I can't even imagine how I could be so wrong about you. I hope you realize I won't let you anywhere near my son now. If you think you're going to get off scot-free, you're not. You know how much Braden means to me and how much I love him. He's the most precious thing I have. I loved you too. I loved you too. I loved you so much. But as it turns out, you betrayed me. And you did it so stupidly. Did you really think what you were planning would go away? I'm not a complete fool. And I'm not surrounded by idiots. The same Anthony Adams. I mean, he knew what you were right away. I'm the one who's a fool for believing you, and you're the one who didn't. Madison realized that she had nothing to lose, and decided to tell her husband what prompted her to this stupid and reckless act. Listen to me, Eric, she exclaimed. I think you should know about this. It was your mother. If she hadn't started blackmailing me and demanding money, none of this would have happened. I'm sorry, but I just can't keep quiet. It's too much. So Madison told her husband, hoping to drive a wedge between her and Jean. Eric, however, resented his wife for taking it out on his mother. What does she have to do with this? He resented. How dare you accuse her of anything? And you tell me about all this as if nothing happened. You also cheated on me, that is, betrayed me. And it's my mother's fault. Well, of course, who else would it be? Eric couldn't take his wife's words adequately. Later, when things had settled down a few days later, Madison had no choice but to leave home that same day and temporarily move back in with her mother and brother and sister. She had some money to rent an apartment. But before she could start a new life, Madison needed to process everything that had happened. She couldn't get her head around the fact that Eric had figured her out so quickly, and she and Greg and Betty wouldn't get a dime. Eric was going to have a separate and very serious conversation with Jean. If what Madison had said was true, it was another low blow. So besides his wife, his mother had betrayed him. And that wasn't an easy thing to get over. Oh my God, son, how could you think such a thing? Jean wailed when Eric asked her directly if Madison was telling the truth. I didn't mean it. I couldn't even imagine that she would come up with something like that. Eric realized that he was partly to blame for what had happened to his son. If he'd agreed to pay for his mother's repairs, it wouldn't have occurred to her to blackmail her daughter-in-law. But cheating was a very mean thing to do. And Eric couldn't understand why his mother hid the fact of his wife's infidelity from him. Why are you doing this to me? Did you have the decency to hide the fact that Madison was cheating on me? Bringing a lover into our apartment and having fun with him in our marital bed. Son, but I meant well. Jean sighed bitterly. I didn't want to destroy your family. since you chose Madison and she gave birth to your son. Then it was meant to be. Fate had decreed it. I had no right to interfere. I was hoping that after this she'd come to her senses, get a job. After all, she wasn't doing anything good. But instead of coming to her senses, she faked her son's kidnapping. How was I supposed to know she was capable of that? I guess Braden was the only good thing left in Eric's life after everything that had happened. His mother and his wife had treated him like scum, and he loved them so dearly. But he decided not to litigate or file a complaint. He would just divorce Madison and help Jean with the repairs. She was finally able to tell Eric why she'd resisted selling the apartment. And after that, everything fell into place. Eric was a big dreamer. After listening to his mother, he immediately started building barricades in his head and inventing secrets, which made Jean smile skeptically. "Son," she grinned, "do you really think that if we take apart the old rubble, we'll find something we don't know about? Do you believe it yourself?" That's the thing Eric did. That's why he decided to give his mother money from his savings for the repairs. If Jean hadn't told him about his late grandmother's instructions, he never would have agreed to renovate this wreck. That's how many months of life and wasted time to remove debris, replace wiring. Flooring will take at least 3 months, and you have to supervise the workers. And who better than Eric to do all that? Who else will help his mother if not his beloved only son? Eric didn't know what to do. So much had happened in his life lately. Not so long ago, he was absolutely happy and could not even imagine that everything would turn out this way. First of all, the man had to deal with his wife, who in all likelihood will claim the joint apartment. Eric did not think that everything would turn out this way, and did not insure himself in case of divorce. He hoped that Madison had enough conscience not to tear a piece of at least from his son, especially since the house was on credit, and she hadn't made a single payment in all that time. But Eric was wrong. When Madison came to her senses a little after everything that had happened, the first thing she thought of was the apartment. She wanted half of it, of course. How could it be otherwise? It was jointly owned property, after all. At least that was the law. And Eric knew he could hardly argue with that. Eric was willing to give his wife anything to give up her son. He offered a fair deal. He would forget about the whole unpleasant story with the kidnapping and extortion, and she would write an official renunciation of Braden. That's the deal. Otherwise, he'll take action. According to him, if they wanted to, they'd find evidence that she'd kidnapped her own son for ransom. Madison didn't see this coming. She was used to her spouse always being soft and going easy on her. True, Eric had been able to forgive his wife anything before, even infidelity, but not what she'd done. "Do you realize how immoral this is?" he asked. "What if we hadn't found Braden? If Anthony Adams hadn't realized this was your idea? What would you have done with the boy if I hadn't paid the ransom?" Madison didn't know the answer and only shrugged her shoulders. She hadn't expected such a development herself. Now she had a difficult choice to make. "Daughter, do it, please," Betty instructed, hoping Madison would help her around the house again. "You've done so much wrong. If you go to jail, I won't survive it. We've already got 7 of us. How are you going to raise your son on your own? You figure it out. Leave Braden to Eric. You're still young. You'll find happiness." For Madison, happiness was about money and freedom. She'd learned that during her years of marriage. Her son was a burden. She didn't want to spend her life raising him, so she agreed to Eric's proposal. After that, Eric began to repair the apartment of Jean's mother, with whom he had little contact. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forgive her for taking part in the adventure. Jean understood everything and hoped that Eric would cool down and accept everything that had happened. Most importantly, Madison had disappeared from Eric's life. That was something that Jean was very happy about. Despite the guilt she felt, she realized that it was for the best. If she hadn't caught Madison with her lover and offered to pay her off, Eric might have lived a lifetime of lies. Now, despite the loss, her son had a chance to build a real relationship. That was gratifying, especially since the money lost in the divorce was more than recouped in the most unexpected way. It turned out that Alexandra Georgia not in vain asked her daughter not to sell the apartment. The woman had one secret. Soon after the renovation began, mother and son discovered something that made them have to urgently dismiss the workers. They couldn't let either of them know the contents of the stash, which was deep in the wall. As soon as Eric, who had taken some time off to supervise the repairs, saw some strange door, he immediately informed the workers that they could rest temporarily. "How come?" marveled one of them. "We've only just begun." "You'll continue later," replied Eric, who was confident that he could open the hiding place on his own. He immediately called his mother, who was temporarily living with Braden in his apartment. Jean had nowhere else to go during the renovation, and Eric, deep down, was glad to have his mother around. Otherwise, who would take care of Madison's son? She was no longer with them, and never would be. Jean rushed to the apartment with her grandson. By then, Eric had already opened the stash and was sitting on the dirty floor, reading some old dusty notebook and going through some gold jewelry. "Mother of God," Jean exclaimed when she saw it all. "What the hell is this?" It turned out that Alexandra Georgia was not so simple as she seemed at first sight, and had made quite a substantial fortune during her life, which, however, she had not been able to use, for she had received all this gold as gifts from her numerous cavaliers. That was what it was called at the time. No one would ever dare to talk about anything like that openly. For many years, the woman kept both silence and gold, which during the renovation of the apartment she hid in a special cache, made by the hands of her spouse. "It turns out that Dad knew about all this," Jean muttered confusedly, going through the gold jewelry and reading the lines of her mother's personal diary, which she also put in the stash and did not take out for many years. "Well, Grandma's got it going on," muttered Eric, who was in complete shock at the find. Jean shared her son's feelings completely. Like him, she couldn't believe what she had just read. It was beyond her usual reality of right and wrong and all kinds of principles, and the woman didn't know how to feel about it. Though on the other hand, what did it all matter anyway? Her mother was long since in the grave, and Jean knew so little of her past that it was certainly not her place to judge or condemn Alexandra Georgia. She had done what she thought was right, and no one had the right to point a finger at her, especially not after her death. The question before Eric was what to do with all this now. Grandmother was trying for the future, including his future. She also wanted her children and grandchildren to live richly after her death, which was written in her diary. But it will not be possible to realize it here, he reasoned. Firstly, there is too much gold, and secondly, there are rare and very interesting specimens which can be very valuable. His grandmother's admirers were high-ranking people, and these gifts could be used very profitably. Eric realized that if he sold the entire contents of the small chest, the money would be enough for the rest of his life. Not that he wanted to quit his job and parasitize on everything. It was just that it was a pretty decent capital for the future. And first of all, the man thought not of himself, but of his son, for whom he wanted to provide a good start, so that Braden would not have to break through the wall for career and money. And except for Anthony Adams, Eric had no one else to consult with. He was the only one who could come up with a good idea. And only the chief had such extensive connections, with the help of which the received gold could be converted into big money without the risk of getting into serious trouble with the law. Of course, Eric had offered him a share, as he was convinced it was the right thing to do. But Anthony Adams refused and, laughing, confessed that he had an offer for Eric that he was sure he couldn't refuse. Just as he had a few years ago, Eric smiled. "What's true is true," nodded Anthony Adams, who also noticed that there was such a resemblance. Anthony Adams had long dreamed of growing his business overseas. He was always striving for more, and was by no means going to stop there. And who but Eric he was to send on a long business trip. "There, you live there, and observe everything," the chief reasoned. Perhaps you'll get the hang of it and won't want to come back, and I'll help you move the wealth overseas. I've got one man who'll do it right." And it was indeed another offer that could not be refused. A change of scenery was the only thing that could help Eric at that moment, and naturally he agreed at once. And after a while, as Anthony Adams expected, he got used to it. Not a year later, as the man began a completely different life, he met his true love, although he put a ban on personal relationships and no longer hoped for anything. Now Eric had everything he could dream of, and really big money, and his own business, which he ran in parallel with the affairs of Anthony Adams, paying tribute for support and help, and a loving wife and mother who had moved in with Braden when Eric finally settled overseas. He never even thought about Madison. But when she found out who Eric had become and how he lived now, she regretted having done that to him. But it was too late to change anything. Those times when Eric had loved her and was willing to do anything for her were irrevocably gone. Now he had a new love. And not a false one, but a real one, fully earned at the cost of betrayal and suffering that could have been avoided if he had opened his eyes a little earlier to the woman who had always been by his side. I can imagine how surprised she'll be when she finds out we're getting married. Jennifer froze after overhearing a conversation in the cafe. Jennifer had always been considered an outgoing and cheerful girl. She had an attractive appearance, pleasant voice, good manners, so she easily got along with people. The slender blonde knew her advantages and skillfully used them. Short denim shorts and a black t-shirt with a pink panther from her travels. She was tanned and trim. Girls with a figure like that were usually described as slim. The barely perceptible smile and the twinkle in her eyes could drive anyone crazy. Jennifer wasn't the type to act arrogant, though. She was quite easy to talk to, but also clearly knew the boundaries. One day, she and her friends went to the beach. They decided to have a picnic right on the catamarans that were available for rent. The four girlfriends quickly organized everything, put together bags, swimsuits, towels, and some food and drinks, then drove to Sunny Beach by car. That was the name of the area where you could have a great vacation. At the beach set up for catamaran rentals, the girls were met by a young guy who worked there. He was wearing a short-sleeved shirt. The girls were in a good mood, not averse to flirting. They were bantering with each other, laughing and creating a joyful atmosphere. A sort of water bike with 4 seats and a platform for company allowed for bags and those wishing to rest. In mid-August, the sun was still very hot. Jennifer and Ashley threw towels over their shoulders, trying to protect them from possible burns. "Take your seats," Jennifer said. "Who's going to row?" "Girls, get in already." Time's running out. The boy hurried, and Ashley, eager for a quick dip in the cool water, was already splashing in. The girls' laughter broke out again. "Let's eat first," Emily said, pulling food out of her bags and setting it on the catamaran's ledge, a makeshift table. Salted fish, boiled rice, smoked chicken, grapes, and drinks appeared on it. "Oh, that's it. I'm diving," Jennifer said, standing on the edge of the catamaran in shorts and a tank top. After looking around at her friends and smiling broadly, she put her arms out in front of her and dove headfirst into the water. A dense plume of air bubbles rushed after her, struggling to catch up, but they proved too light and quickly burst on the surface of the river. "Jennifer, you're crazy," a real prankster, Ashley said as she prepared to jump. There was a joyous shout. Jennifer showed herself on the surface. "Oof," she shouted into the water, splashing away. As she climbed onto the catamaran, the other girls' jumps followed. Ashley didn't take any chances, but slowly descended into the water. The happy faces and satisfied smiles said that the company really liked the place. Finally, it was time for the meal. Appetizing pieces of fish and chicken disappeared, caught by their fingers and sent to their mouths. "Hello, beauties," was heard from the side. Jennifer turned around and saw the exact same catamaran with 2 guys on board. A third was floating behind, holding onto a metal pipe. Catching Jennifer's eye, he waved at her, the vaguely satisfied smile of a well-fed cat. Jennifer only hummed, though she had time to notice his large, strong shoulders and tanned body. "Boys, alas, we're out of fish," said Sarah, who didn't like it when guys showed up in the company of girls. "And we were just about to buy you a treat," one of them mumbled. Jennifer got tired of hearing this and dove back into the river. The water was a stunning color, so clear and transparent in the sun that the girl felt incredible freedom and enjoyment of the water world. She could hold her breath for a long time, and so she was still underwater. The girl moved towards the surface. Oh no, something touched her feet. Jennifer sped up her movement. Now she could clearly feel her feet being touched by something unknown. She decided lightning fast that it was time to get out. But as she rushed forward, a man's face appeared in front of her. Jennifer drew in more air, ready to fend off the attack, but just in time to recognize the guy holding onto the catamaran. "Did you scare me?" Jennifer exclaimed. "Yes, that's what I wanted," he replied nonchalantly. The girl frowned. She was not prepared for such strange signs of attention. The boys were engaged in a rather unusual game. They were coming critically close to the girl's watercraft and then sailing further away. In the end, Sarah got tired of it all, and she stealthily climbed onto their catamaran and threw one of them into the water, and then the other. In this way, they managed to defeat the river pirates who were eager to violate their personal boundaries. Jennifer climbed onto the catamaran and sat on it, dangling her feet into the water. She fixed her hair, twisting the strands on her head in her purchased top and shorts. She looked seductive. She was basking in the sun, whose rays caressed her skin so pleasantly. But then a familiar face emerged from the water right in front of her again. This guy was definitely up to something. He calmly swam up to Jennifer and, placing his hands on the raft on either side of her, pushed himself up, half out of the water. Under his weight, one side of the catamaran sank into the water, and Jennifer, losing her balance, pulled forward. But to avoid contact with the intrusive stranger, she leaned backward, resting her hands on the floor. In a matter of seconds, her brain had assessed this guy as quite good-looking. His well-defined cheekbones and large mouth spoke of his love of life and ability to get what he wanted. And even now, it didn't bother him in the slightest that he was acting rather brash. But Jennifer's interest was piqued as well. She was curious to see what he would do next. She assumed he would go back into the water, but instead he slowly, calmly pulled himself even more forward, piling his body on top of the girl's. The girl was taken aback and opened her plump lips. And the guy from the water became so bold that he literally kissed Jennifer. She was outraged by the strange excitement that came out of nowhere and suddenly slapped him hard. But that didn't stop him at all. He bit her right thigh and then disappeared back under the water. Jennifer shuddered and climbed fully onto the catamaran. By this time, the boat's rental had come to an end. The whole hour had flown by. The girls had had enough of swimming and splashing in the water and were glad to be back on shore. After the cold appetizers, they wanted something hot. All four of them sat down at a table in the cafe. The waiter brought a folder with the menu, eyeing them languidly. They began to follow his index finger as it traveled down the lines. Soon the table was filled with flavorful food. Jennifer rubbed her palms together, anticipating the taste of her favorite hodgepodge. Hodgepodge. The perfect ending to the evening. Ashley laughed at her. "No licking," Jennifer parried. "I don't know about you, but I'll personally drink some of the dark stuff," Sarah mumbled, ducking into an oversized mug. Divine, she rolled her eyes, expressing her pleasure. Empty bellies were quickly filled, and the set table emptied quickly as well. The girls were about to leave when a guy approached them. Jennifer took her eyes aside, not wanting to see this misunderstanding. Leaving already, he inquired, purposely pointing his gaze in her direction. "Yeah, I need to hurry up so I can make a run to the wind. Rabies shot," she muttered unhappily, rubbing the bite site on her thigh. Sorry, couldn't resist. Your legs were too sweet, he mouthed, embarrassing the girl. Then he introduced himself. It turned out his name was Mitchell. The girls responded with their names, except Jennifer. Just then a waiter approached with a bill in hand. Mitchell reacted quickly, handing him a bank card. Jennifer glanced at the guy and hummed. Afterward, she caught the looks of her friends. They were looking at her puzzled, but it was time to leave. So the girls got up from the table. Jennifer didn't linger either, but Mitchell had one more surprise for her. He held out a single purple rose to her. Where did he get that from? Did he bring it in his breeches? Jennifer tried to ignore the flower, but Ashley still couldn't stand it and accepted it instead. Jennifer, look, Ashley pushed her in the side. What? She asked irritably, glancing reluctantly at what was coming from her right. Ashley rounded her eyes and showed her friend the note. It had the sender's number and name written in it. She held it out to Jennifer and she slipped it into her pocket after looking at it. Monday printed out the week, and one by one the days spread out, all in business and obligations. Jennifer worked at a flower shop. She adored her job and didn't want to change it for anything. She loved her workplace, the material she interacted with, and the endless imagination she could bring to life, creating unique bouquets and exclusive arrangements, creating something with her hands. She did not feel that she was working, but creating and enjoying it. But here the door to the salon opened, and the very guy appeared on the threshold. "Good afternoon," he said hello. Then he leisurely approached the showcase and chose the largest bouquet. He told the sales clerk about it, and she accepted the payment from him. "Jennifer, is this for you?" The boy said. "I'm sorry, but if I'd bought the bouquet at another flower store, it could be seen as hidden competition." "How did you find me?" the girl inquired. "It wasn't hard. Some of your friends turned out to be more sociable than you. But that's okay. I think that in the future we will find a common language with you," he said, looking into her eyes. And there was a smile on his face that was barely recognizable, the kind that comes from people who feel they're one step ahead. This time, Jennifer decided that the guy had shown enough persistence to return the favor. After all, the one who made the first move is the one who should keep it going. As time went on, Jennifer realized that she didn't regret at all that she had once reciprocated his affection. The guy turned out to be a very attentive and caring suitor. He worked as the head of a construction team. They had been about 10 years engaged, not only in lifting old houses, but also built from scratch small-sized apartment buildings. Jennifer was proud of what her boyfriend was doing. The young people spent a lot of time together. Sometimes the guy picked her up from work, and they went for a walk with a final dinner in a cafe. And other times they met in the park and just wandered through the alleys, enjoying the autumn colors of the trees. And their relationship slowly began to grow stronger. And that reckless and unpredictable guy turned into a caring and loving young man, and perhaps a future fiancé. At least that was Jennifer's dream. She stood at the window and looked thoughtfully ahead. There, beyond the window ahead, could be seen other high-rise buildings with still empty playgrounds. All of Jennifer's thoughts were focused on the future in her life, where she was a happy wife and loving mother. Jennifer, her mother called softly to her again. "Would you put the kettle on and tell me what clouds my daughter is in?" she asked with a sly smile. She was familiar with this state of mind. It was a pity. It was all behind her. She had never married since her husband died. Rose. That was Jennifer's mom's name, was a beautiful woman. In her 40s, she still looked very attractive. Jennifer was born early. She had just turned 19 years old. She began to blossom like a blooming rose. How did Jason come into her life? Broad-shouldered, tanned. He quickly captured her attention, but unfortunately they weren't destined to live a long and happy life together. When Jason left them, Rosa at first tried to somehow establish her personal life. But raising a 9-year-old daughter took a lot of energy and time. She had to think about what to feed and clothe her tomorrow. It wasn't easy. Rosa dreamed of love, but only without any hope. Especially looking at her own daughter, who day by day grew up, changed, and turned into a young woman that was clearly beginning to supplant her and push her aside, taking her place. But Rosa accepted it and managed to survive this little tragedy within herself. And from her husband, she was left a small 2-room apartment in which they lived together with Jennifer. It was a little cramped, but it was a little okay. They'd lived together for 12 years, and they would. "Mom, do you want a lemon?" Jennifer asked, shouting from the kitchen. "One slice, and 1 spoonful of sugar," Rosa answered. Jennifer appeared in the hall with a tray on which there was a fragrant steaming tea with sweets. "Ah, what a lemon flavor. Just lovely," Rosa said, taking the first sip. "And imagine if we were now in the country, in the fresh air, sitting in the gazebo, listening to the birds singing and admiring the play of sunlight," dreamily said his mother. "Mom, are you a poet now?" Jennifer laughed, taking her first sip and biting into a strawberry cookie. A dog named Mike climbed into her lap. He was a toy terrier. He had a gorgeous short coat of white fur. He made himself comfortable and felt quite cozy. With eyes full of longing and misery, he looked furtively at his mistress. At last the heavens heard him, and he got a treat. "I'm thinking of raising the cottage and putting in a blooming garden that would be nice. What do you think?" she asked her daughter. Jennifer remembered the plot of land they had inherited from her father. Her father had loved to go there. He had found some happiness in that solitude. Jennifer was a little surprised at her mother's statement, since she rarely ever went there. And if they came with the family to the cottage, Rosa always found a reason to be dissatisfied. It was mosquitoes biting her, or a gnat poking her in the eye. Every time she was annoyed by the green grass growing everywhere. And then to hear her mother say something like that was a surprise to Jennifer. Even so, she liked the idea very much. "Of course, Mom, it would be great if we could keep what our father once started," her daughter answered her. In front of her eyes, she remembered that small plot of land where her father had managed to put a fence and a small hut. The place was good, located near the city, but it was located in a relative lowland, and it often drowned. That's why the house had to be raised higher. It was sunny here. Nearby was a forest and a gorgeous spacious field, where you could leisurely stroll and breathe the forest air, and in winter suddenly take skis and go on the forest road, and down a hill. Jennifer remembered well how her father had taught her how to ski, how to turn, and how to ski downhill without fear. Thinking about it, Jennifer suddenly remembered that her boyfriend, Matthew, was doing just that. So she thought she could talk to him about it. "You know, Mom, I just realized that Matthew's in the house lifting business. I'll talk to him, and I think he'd be willing to help us out," Jennifer said. "But for a fee, of course, at a discount," Rosa added. "Yes, exactly," Jennifer pointed out. The next time she met her boyfriend, they were walking through the park. Matthew was telling Jennifer about his childhood. It turned out that he had grown up in an orphanage and remembered his parents very well, with whom he still kept in touch. This was despite the fact that they had surrendered him to the orphanage when he was 7 years old. His mother always told him that she couldn't have done otherwise. His father was on the road a lot and rarely brought money home. The rent was huge, and she still had to support herself and the child. Yes, she'd put Matthew in an orphanage. She told him she'd be sure to pick him up in a month. But when she came back a month later, it turned out she'd only come to see him. And she would tell him again that she would pick him up next time in about a month. At first, Matthew believed his mother, believed that she would really pick him up and not leave him here. But as time went on, he realized that each time it was put off until later. At one point, he developed a huge resentment towards them. When he turned 18, he finally became a senior. He came home, and was discouraged. After all, the house was orderly and cozy. His mother met him in a fancy, expensive dress. When she saw her son on the threshold of the house, she was extremely surprised. She stood in front of him holding a glass of red wine in her hands. She was wearing expensive jewelry and heavy gold earrings. Raising her hand up and waving slightly, as if correcting her numerous bracelets on her wrist, she said, "Ah, who do I see? Son, how big have you gotten? How have you grown?" His mother spoke. Matthew was even a little taken aback by this greeting. She had not been interested in him at all for the last few years, and had not visited him once in 4 years. Come in, she said, opening the door wide. Matthew stepped hesitantly into the house. His mother went to the mirror and fixed his hair. "Was your visit so unexpected?" "I didn't even have time to prepare." She turned to face her son and was silent for a few seconds. "I'm sorry, darling, I didn't visit you, but I had my reasons." Rather, she began to justify herself. "You know yourself, I had to work. Money doesn't come easy. Would you like to have a little drink? I've got some fine 10-year-old wine." "Your father's at work, as usual," she said, going to the cupboard and pulling out a bottle of red wine. The woman spoke to him as if there had been no shelter, no separation, no endless waiting, no tears shed as Matthew realized he had been abandoned, forgotten and left in the care of complete strangers. It was strange, incomprehensible. The young man realized once again that no one wanted his feelings and that his parents had never needed him. "Shall I pour some wine into the glasses?" Amber, grabbing one of them, took a small sip and walked a little forward. It was pretty clear that they had absolutely nothing to talk about. Matthew's parents lived a very different life. The boy kept listening to his mother and didn't know what to say to her in response. To be honest, he had expected a little different. Amber continued to remain standing still. Her look was confused. It even looked like she was holding a glass of wine just to pretend to be very busy. She looked at her son. She knew exactly what she had done. Except that her pride and her desire to remain good did not allow her to meet and talk to him properly. "I have to go now," he mumbled. Amber closed her mouth to say something to him, but there was nothing to say. Matthew lowered the corners of his lips slightly and headed for the door, saying goodbye. "Wait." Suddenly his mother spoke up. Matthew stopped and looked at her again. "Take care of yourself," she said. Matthew nodded at her words and then left her house. Such a revelation from Matthew touched Jennifer to the core. She felt genuinely sorry for him. She told him that he had a big heart for being able to find the strength to keep in touch with them no matter what. She decided to change the subject and told him that they had been left a house from their father. She also said that her mother had decided to take over the property and clean it up. "That's a good thing," Matthew said. "Yes, I think so too. Except that my mother wants to raise the cabin first, or move it to another place. And I thought of you right away." "No, don't worry. I wanted to tell you right away that the work will be paid for, as it should be. It's just that I know you and trust you as an experienced builder," Ashley said. Matthew replied, "Sure, no problem. We just need to pick a time for me to get there and assess the situation." On the appointed day, Jennifer, along with Matthew, were to arrive at the property where Jennifer's mother was waiting for them. However, just before evening, the flower store received an order for an arrangement for a major restaurant. They had ordered black cubes of flowers from Jennifer before, and they really liked her work. They didn't want to miss out on such a customer, especially since they had a friendly and trusting relationship. Jennifer called Matthew and said, "Matthew, hi. Listen, I've got a job. I'd hate to turn it down. You should probably go by yourself, and your mom will meet you there and tell you everything and explain it. And then I'll meet you tonight when you pick me up from work." She loved being around him so much as a little girl. She took every opportunity to be in that role every time. Matthew agreed and drove straight to the dacha on the Baikal Highway. As he drove a little way from the city, he was confronted with a riot of colors. The foliage on the trees was ablaze with orange and red colors. Bright yellow flashes added color. Here a brick garage showed up, after which he had to turn right. Matthew knew that such gardening areas often lacked numbers on the houses. He called Rosa and asked for directions. She replied, "Go straight ahead. I'll meet you here." Soon Matthew saw a slender woman who looked quite young. He was even surprised that Jennifer was her daughter. Matthew parked and got out of the car, said hello, and introduced himself. Rose was surprised too, to say the least. She hadn't expected to see such a handsome and attractive man. Her eyes quickly assessed his figure and face. Matthew was a little worried, but wasted no time in getting right down to business. He looked around the property, walked around, and then back to the cabin. It was in the corner of the house, faintly lit by the sun. Matthew walked around it on all sides, assessing it with his gaze. We can basically pick it up. It won't be difficult. Have you picked out a place to put it yet?" he inquired. "Honestly, I hadn't thought about it, since I assumed it would only be lifted," Rose replied confusedly from beside Matthew. She was feeling tense and couldn't explain the reason for it, but she knew for sure that she liked Matthew a lot. They discussed the nuances of moving the house some more. Rosa asked about the cost of labor and materials. Matthew calmly and easily explained the step-by-step process of the work. Rosa liked the way he explained everything. She literally melted as she listened to him talk about moving the house. Afterwards, they agreed to call each other when Rosa had decided what to do next. Interestingly, Matthew also liked Rosa very much. He was attracted by her maturity, wisdom, and childlike directness, which slipped through during communication. Before leaving, Matthew wished the lady of the house well. Rose, innocence itself, smiled faintly at him, lowering her eyes to the floor. When the builder left, Rosa was relieved. She couldn't believe she'd been so excited to meet a handsome young man. The next time Matthew called Rosa to ask clarifying questions, she felt her heart beat faster. She was glad to hear his voice. His timbre made the woman anxious, and she sometimes held her breath without noticing it. Only when she caught herself doing so did she remind herself to exhale. Jennifer and Matthew were well aware of their attraction and obvious interest in each other. However, they didn't know what to do about it next. After all, Jennifer and Matthew had already discussed their upcoming wedding. They were serious about getting married so that they could spend their lives in love, fidelity, and understanding. Matthew cared deeply for Jennifer and couldn't do that to her. He couldn't tell her that it was over between them, that what was happening between them was losing its meaning. Matthew, as well as Rose, wanted to banish thoughts about the progression of their relationship. But those thoughts, like pesky bees with sweet pollen, circled around, teasing and beckoning with the scent of love and pleasure. Rose waited for Matthew to call her with clarifying questions about the future project, and Matthew waited for Rosa to call him to clarify anything else. Every time her phone rang, she hurried to look at the screen, to make sure it was him. And how frustrated she got when the other person called. Rosa had become exactly like a girl, wrapped up in the feelings that were building up and running through her body and mind. But Rosa also realized that she could not destroy her own daughter's happiness. She realized that she had to keep herself in control, not to give in to emotion, giving preference to sound reasoning. Thinking about all this, she realized that as a mother she had to think of her child first and foremost. But when she told herself this, another inner voice objected. You spent your whole life raising your daughter. You took care of her, raised her, worked at a job you didn't like so that your family wouldn't be poor. And now, when your happiness is so close, you give it up. Rose stood in front of the mirror, studying her face and trying to find the right answer there. She was really struggling with herself, and it was unbearably difficult. The voice told her that she was still young, beautiful, full of strength. She had her whole life ahead of her and could build a new happiness. But were her feelings for Matthew real? Maybe she was fooling herself, impressed with him only because of the possibility of a new home? Rosa certainly thought about that too. After all, what luck to kill two birds with one stone: a new home and a handsome man. As they say, you can't tell what's going on. How difficult it is to discern the true motives lurking in the depths of each of us. People are so used to surrounding themselves with reasons, purposes, explanations, and reasoning that in the end they cease to understand anything when they close themselves off to these circumstances and coincidences. Then Matthew met up with Jennifer again. He had managed to miss her. How did it go? Were you able to work things out? I hope my mother didn't overload you with tasks? The girl asked, smiling. Yes, your mother and I agreed easily and have already discussed the first stage of the work. Matthew answered cheerfully. Listen, that's wonderful. I'm very glad that my mother decided to take on this house. My dad loved this place. And it's a nice place. I'd hate to see it abandoned and neglected, Jennifer explained. Then she walked over to Matthew and climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his hips. She pulled him against her, stroking his head, kissing his neck. Their lips made contact. What a sweet kiss it was. Matthew gripped Jennifer's hips tighter, and then, changing positions, lowered her onto the couch. Once on top of her, Jennifer struggled, trying to get out from under him. Matthew accepted the challenge and continued to play with her. Heavy breathing and squeals could be heard as Jennifer kept trying to jokingly beat Matthew, but eventually she was exhausted and gave up. A joyous laugh escaped his lips. Matthew also laughed as he continued to fool around. Just like when you were a kid. I'm going to crush you with my knees, Jennifer exclaimed, using her final argument to win. Come on, push, and harder. But Jennifer, pull yourself together. Matthew lifted her up. But Jennifer could do nothing as the rest of her strength was taken away by the laughter. It was important for her to breathe, not to choke on the incredible joy that was overwhelming her at the moment. Finally, Matthew lowered himself onto the girl with his whole body and stroked her hair. Their faces became more serious. They enjoyed looking at each other. Matthew scrutinized her brown eyes, her nose, lips, and chin. He leaned over and kissed her neck. The most vulnerable place inside both of them, passion flared and all the extra clothes flew away. I'm sure you're the man I'd like to spend the rest of my life with. Tell me, is it the same for you? Jennifer asked Matthew after they had enjoyed each other. They were lying on the couch, covered by a blanket. They were now in Matthew's apartment. He had purchased it relatively recently and was very pleased with it. The apartment was in a nice and presentable neighborhood, the sunny side of the spacious room. I am very happy to have met someone like you, he said. You are the most precious thing to me, and I don't want to lose you, the guy added. At that moment, he looked a little tense and his gaze was inward. Is something wrong? The girl asked him. It was as if she suspected that something had changed between them. No, everything's fine. I just pictured our future with you, family life, our possible children. A house full of love and good food. You're going to cook, aren't you? He asked, looking at Jennifer. She waved her head in the negative. And baking pies, as Basic Matthew shook his chin negatively. How could it be? You're going to be my wife, so you're going to cook, he said, insisting. Yes, that's right. I'll be your wife. Beautiful, rested, happy. And let the cook, whom we will hire to work for us, do the cooking, she said, as if nothing had happened. Oh yes, Matthew was surprised. A businesswoman, the potential wife replied, the most beautiful, rested, happy wife, will be filled with your energy from the stars of extraterrestrial planets, Matthew joked as he wrapped Jennifer in his arms. They laughed again, and the couple hid under the covers. But now the wedding preparations began. It was an exciting moment for Jennifer. She wanted everything to go right, everything to be beautiful, exquisite. She wanted to be in a snow-white wedding dress, so that all the guests were in jackets and outfits. She personally puzzled over decorating the hall herself, with fresh flowers, choosing the color scheme and their arrangement. "Jennifer, baby, you're a bride, not a florist. Give this job to someone else. What are you struggling for?" Ashley, her friend, turned to her. "No, I want it to be beautiful. Especially since I feel like they're all doing something wrong," the bride to be replied, enthusiastically arranging a large basket of flowers, one flower at a time. "I understand you. I like to arrange my clothes the way I want them in my store too," Ashley said. "Today is an amazing day. It's the day two people seal their bond with rings and create another unit of society." A lot of guests were gathered in front of the registry office. All of them wanted to be present at the registration of Jennifer and Matthew's wedding. White cars were decorated with bouquets and gold ribbons. Matthew was waiting for Jennifer in the hall. He was a little worried, but here he caught a glimpse of Rosa. She was wearing a beautiful burgundy dress with transverse translucent inserts of the same color. It fit her figure perfectly, emphasizing her slim waist. Her brown hair lay in waves on her shoulders. She looked at Matthew, and it was as if he could read everything in her gaze. As it happened, fate had decided otherwise, and he'd met Jennifer much earlier. There was nothing he could do about it now, because he was already a husband. The woman smiled softly at him, her eyes squinting slightly. But then the applause broke out, and the bride finally appeared in the hall. She looked like an angel descended from heaven, all in white with a long veil. She approached Matthew slowly and looked like a princess from some kingdom. Matthew was even a little timid in front of her, because she looked so good and statuesque. Her face shone with a smile. Matthew was relieved to see the shape of her face and the open mouth with the corners of her lips turned up. The unnecessary tension immediately vanished somewhere. She looked at him with a gentle gaze, and Matthew was once again convinced that he had made the right choice. Even in spite of the recent events, the registrar read out the necessary standard phrases, and both bride and groom said their I do's. Both signed their signatures, after which they exchanged rings. Jennifer was overflowing with happiness from the inside out. She was ready to jump up on the spot and scream so loudly that everyone around her could hear how happy she was. There was loud and boisterous applause. Flashes flashed across the room. Just everyone went out into the large foyer. As immediately there was a loud clap, it was a friend of the groom unsealed a bottle of champagne. The guests amicably gathered in a pile of crystal glasses. Their clinking sounded, and the golden bubbles sang and hurried to take their places. After the registry office, all the guests went to the restaurant to properly celebrate this solemn event. Here already awaited them beautifully served tables filled with a variety of dishes, appetizers, and drinks. The invited toastmaster prepared unforgettable contests for the guests, which left no one indifferent. The newlyweds performed their unique wedding dance. They specially studied it to dance on this day. Their couple was irresistible. They moved to the beat of the music confidently and calmly. They twirled in the dance as if they were floating in the air. They looked at each other without noticing anyone around them. Toward the end of the evening, the toastmaster announced the white dance. "The ladies invite the gentlemen. Come on, dear guests, don't be shy. Fill the hall," she said, and then headed to the table for a little rest and tea and cake. "Jennifer, my sunshine, you are always beautiful. And today especially, so be careful when you ask me to dance. Or better still, don't go at all," Matthew said, holding his bride's hand. She covered her mouth with her palm and giggled. "All right, darling, I'll do just the opposite," she said. Then, with a sly glance at Matthew, she headed toward the guest she'd spotted earlier. He realized that nothing of the sort was going to happen, but still he found himself thinking that his wife was too beautiful. "Matthew, may I ask you to dance?" A woman's voice sounded behind him. He turned around and was surprised to see Rose in front of him. Her gaze was enigmatic. She held out her hand to him. "I'd be honored," he said, rising from his chair. "I'm very glad that my daughter's husband is a man like you," Anna said. "I think you can make my daughter happy." She looked into Matthew's eyes and he said nothing. Not because he didn't know what to say, but he just didn't even think about it. Rose, on the other hand, saw it a little differently. "I've done a lot for my daughter in my time. I forgot about my personal life just to make her happy," she said. The two moved slowly in a dance. Matthew listened attentively to his mother-in-law. "Oh, how I wish I could once again experience that very feeling called love," she said, looking into Matthew's eyes. "You tell me, I'm still good-looking?" she asked in surprise. It put Matthew in a bit of a stupor at first, but then he found something to answer. "Absolutely, you look great," he mumbled, deliberately addressing her in you to keep his distance. "I beg of you, please, not again. Speak to me on you, because I'm not that old yet, am I?" She asked again, and again she fixed her gaze on his eyes. Matthew immediately realized that this woman was not as simple as she might seem at first glance, and she was clearly playing a double game. "There's no doubt you look beautiful. I would hardly believe you have such a grown daughter if I were not her husband," he muttered, and laughed. "It is indeed a shame that fate has brought us together in this way. But it's more interesting this way," she said. And Matthew suddenly noticed the unfamiliar light in her eyes. He realized again that this woman was very attractive. It was as if she was at the peak of her beauty at almost 40 years of age. She still continued to look into his eyes, and Matthew did the same. He felt as if she was conjuring him, wreathing him with her eyes, her facial expressions, her perfume scent. Why on earth is she doing this? Why is she playing this game and seducing him on purpose? When the dance was over, Matthew kissed her hand and then turned back to his favorite bride. "You move great," Jennifer remarked, who looked at them from the sidelines. "Yeah, have you noticed that?" Matthew interjected. "Yeah, my partner, you wouldn't believe it, but he suddenly got dizzy and left me halfway through the dance," Jennifer admitted. "Oh my God, what did you do to him?" Matthew playfully interjected. "Nothing. Just told him to move a little faster," the bride replied, shrugging her delicate shoulders. Immediately after the wedding, Rosa returned to talking about building the house, as the winter in the region was quite warm, so the work could be started even in November. Before the wedding, the matter had been on the back burner for a while, and now Rosa wanted to revisit it. She called Matthew and made an appointment. She was going to make a contract with him. Matthew arrived at the cottage as they had previously agreed with Rosa. Despite the fact that it was a small house, it was quite cozy. A brick stove with a transparent door through which one could admire the fire. Comfortable, soft sofa, table and wall lamps that created a special atmosphere in the evening. But since it was a sunny day, there was no need for them yet. Parking the car, Matthew opened the gate and looked at the house, smoke billowing from the chimney. He knocked, and the owner opened the door. She was wearing a warm sports suit, which looked very stylish on her. Her hair was gathered into such a bump on the top of her head, which made her face look elongated, and you could see her features clearly. "Ah, come in. How glad I am to see you," cooed Rosa, letting him into the cottage. "Come and be a dear guest," she reckoned, like a cunning fox. Matthew went in and sat down in an armchair near the sofa. It was pretty nice, clean and tidy. Rose looked at Matthew, then shifted her gaze higher. "Oh, I wanted to hang a picture. Found it in the closet the other day. Such a nice painting. And this is where it would fit the most." She mouthed to herself without waiting for an answer. "Of course you will. You've just arrived here," and her face lit up with a smile. She pulled the very painting out of the closet and prepared a ladder in front of the wall. She motioned for Matthew to get up from his seat and then walked over to the wall and held the painting up. Matthew looked at the whole thing and agreed with Rosa. "Now you back up and I'll take a look," she mumbled. Matthew moved closer and took the painting by the wooden frame with the three-dimensional pattern. Rose stood in front of it. When she lowered the painting, she turned to face him. The woman was in no hurry to leave, but instead stretched out her time, looking at her guest absent-mindedly. The man also stared at her. He had not yet had time to realize anything, when Rose suddenly burst into his lips with a passionate kiss. The painting fell out of Matthew's hands and rolled onto the chair. The unknown power Rosa possessed was transmitted to Matthew. The kiss felt good, and for a few seconds he lost his mind. Rosa's lips were so sweet that Matthew didn't realize how the circumstances had turned his head. Within a couple minutes they were horizontal. Rosa left him no choice but to take the initiative. "Only I have one condition," she said when everything happened. "Let's agree to keep this between us. I don't want to hurt my daughter, because you love her." Matthew was in complete agreement. He could hardly understand how this could have happened. He hung the picture above his chair, and afterward they signed the agreement together. The woman looked like a fed-up cat. Matthew returned home full of a variety of feelings: regret, confusion. But he had to admit that he had enjoyed what had happened at the cottage. In the evening he stopped by Jennifer's store and took her home. They drove around town for a while and stopped at a cafe. Matthew kept quiet a lot and tried to avoid looking at Jennifer. He was greatly disturbed by what had happened during the day. "My mom called me," she mumbled, causing additional excitement on his part. "Yeah, what did she say?" Matthew asked, nervous. "She says you made a pact with her." "That's great. I'm glad there's finally some traffic on a long neglected site," his wife said. "You seem a little different today. Are you puzzled about something?" "No, I'm just thinking about where to start," Matthew said. "Thinking about something else." Jennifer took his hand. "Let's think about it later, and now we'll rest," she said with a smile. "Yes, of course," I agree, the husband mumbled, afraid that his wife might recognize what had happened from his embarrassed eyes. They continued to eat dinner. Jennifer talked about the flowers, about the people who came to pick up the bouquets, about the fact that her customer was satisfied with the new compositions. Matthew pretended to listen, inserting phrases, but he couldn't be fully present. He was shocked by what had happened. He never thought he would find himself between two fires. "Dim, can you hear me? Can we go home?" "I'm so sleepy," Jennifer said. Matthew didn't notice how he fell out of the conversation. "Yes, you're right. I'm tired today. I can't wait to go to bed," he said, rising from his seat and kissing her cheek. After the passion, Matthew decided that it couldn't happen again. The next time he saw Rosa, he told her so. The woman replied that she understood him perfectly and agreed. They could have stopped there, if it hadn't been for Rosa, who had no intention of doing so. She had a long, sleeping personality inside her that wanted to come out, to show itself in all its glory. Looking at Matthew, her son-in-law, who was beside his daughter, who was hugging him, who was looking at him, she began to feel jealous inside her. She was aware that it was wrong, but it was too hard for her to deal with her own feelings. She now looked at Matthew not as her daughter's husband, but as a handsome man to whom she had every right. After all, she would try her luck, and then it would be up to him to decide if he wanted to stay with her or still choose a wife. The next day, Jennifer went to work. A new shipment of flowers had arrived yesterday, most of which were white. Jennifer wanted to dilute the plainness a little and paint the individual flowers in other shades. She ordered the paint for them from an online store. Today she brought it with her from home. She poured some cold water into several wagons and then poured powder into each one. In one she placed white roses, in the second white asters, and in the third a flower called lily, which had a large V-shaped bud. Now it was necessary to wait some time for the flower to absorb the water, and it, in turn, had to fill every cell of it to give the desired effect. But by evening, the flowers had taken on stunningly rich and beautiful hues. Jennifer put the gloves back on, took them out and put the flowers in again, but now in clear water. On one hand, a glove caught on a thorn that was carefully hidden behind a leaf. The glove tore, and some of the dye got on the florist's skin. But Jennifer was almost finished with the job, so it wasn't too bad. She finished what she had started and washed her hands afterward. Then she stayed at her workstation, and afterward she locked up the store. She was going home alone tonight. Matthew had called her to let her know that he was running late because the customer had some questions about their work. When Jennifer entered the house, the first thing she did was take a shower. Then she warmed up some food and sat down at the table and turned on a new show on her laptop. While still at work, she was feeling seriously hungry. However, now that she had food in her mouth, she suddenly realized that she didn't have much of an appetite. After eating some pilaf, she pushed her plate away and took tea. She decided to herself that she'd probably overdone the coloring today. Besides, some of it had gotten on her skin. Without waiting until late afternoon, she went to bed. She felt a little dizzy, and it felt like someone was rocking her bed. Within seconds, she fell into a deep and dense darkness. Snakes began to appear from everywhere. They were gigantic in size and stared at Jennifer with burning yellow eyes. They stuck out their twin tongues and hissed. They bunched up in the air and came closer to her. One snake touched her foot and then slowly curved and began to climb up her body. It reached her stomach and touched her tongue a couple times before reaching her chest and above. A blue snake with huge scales that were cold to the touch. The snake coiled around her neck. Jennifer tried to pull it away, but there was no way she could get a grip on it. The snake slipped out of her hands in seconds each time. It was getting harder and harder to breathe. Jennifer strained as hard as she could to push the cold-blooded monster away. The woman felt her entire body become hot. Her forehead covered in sweat, she fought desperately against the snake, but it was clearly stronger. Eventually, she managed to rip it off her chest, and she woke up with a sharp upward thrust of her body. Matthew was next to her. He did his best to calm her down and asked what was wrong. Jennifer was breathing heavily. Her pupils were dilated. Matthew said he would get some water. A wet strand of hair fell over her face. Jennifer struggled to get rid of it. "Is everything all right?" her husband asked. "Are you shivering all over?" He touched his palm to her body. "Yes, I'm fine. I had a horrible, horrible dream," Jennifer complained to him. "It's over now," Matthew reassured her. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, tangling herself in the blankets and taking her husband's hand. When morning came, Jennifer climbed out of bed to start getting ready for work. Matthew always got up before her. As soon as she got out of bed, she immediately felt as if her body was filled with lead. It felt heavy, as if someone had put weight on her shoulders on purpose. Jennifer glanced at the clock. For the first time in her life, she had overslept for work. She tried to speed up to get out of the house faster. In an unfortunate move, she bumped into a table leg. "Damn, that hurts," she said, sitting on the chair and rubbing her sore leg. Finally, she pulled herself together and went outside. She decided to skip breakfast today since she had no appetite at all. Jennifer took her workstation and started going through the notes she usually left for herself so she wouldn't forget anything just in case. This time it was too hot in the store. Even the working air conditioner wasn't exactly filling the room with fresh air. Jennifer spent several hours in constant agony. She was plagued by terrible weakness. Eventually, she was forced to close the store and return home. How happy she was to crawl into bed and do nothing. Her health left much to be desired. Of all the food she could eat, all she could eat was water. When Matthew returned home, he was very surprised to find his wife lying in bed. Jennifer had always been active, and it was impossible to imagine her at such an activity. She told Matthew about her condition. He offered to call a doctor, but the girl refused, saying that tomorrow she would surely be better. Meanwhile, the foundations for the new house were already being poured. Matthew came to the site to see how everything was progressing. His boys were doing a good job. Rosa said there was something she wanted to talk to Matthew about. He didn't mind. They went inside the cabin. So far, the foundation hasn't set. It's still holding on to the rebar, Rose said. Matthew, you've forgotten all about me. Was I really just a fling for you? Matthew hadn't expected that from her. He thought that she was a grown woman and quite aware of her actions. After all, she knew that he was going to marry her daughter, and any further development of their relationship was out of the question. Why do you say that? He asked her a counter question. But Rose, instead of answering, went to the front door and locked it. Matthew suddenly felt like a real hostage. Rose, you and I talked about how we should stop being so close, Matthew said, hoping that this unrestrained, apparently unconcerned woman would be reasonable. Do you really want my daughter to find out? Suddenly, Rosa turned to blackmail. Not at all. You and I had a deal. Look, it was a moment of weakness, and you're the one who started it, Matthew said. Well, if I started it, then I'll continue, she said, stretching the buttons of her cream-colored, loose-fitting blouse. Matthew had already realized that this woman was not as simple as she looked, and that she probably still had a lot of skeletons in her closet. He decided to honor her request, and, taking a couple steps forward, unbuckled his belt and tossed it aside. My daughter Jennifer is a very good girl. She's young, she's beautiful. She has a great figure, Rosa said. Matthew didn't quite understand where she was going with this, or why she was having this conversation. But let it be known to you that not all people are as good on the inside as they are on the outside. Believe me, my boy, she said. What do you mean by that? Matthew didn't understand. You know, Matt, you're just a good man. You're the kind of man I wish I had more of. You hear me? I'd hate for you to end up with a broken heart. But why should I be broken-hearted all of a sudden? Matthew asked, still not knowing what he was talking about. I'm certainly glad you and Jennifer got married. But I have to warn you, she's a pretty fickle person. You know, creative people, they're so fickle. One day they have one thing on their mind, the next day another. One day she's married to you, the next week she'll say she's out of love. And the interesting thing is that it's perfectly normal for them, Rosa said casually. Are you saying that Jennifer married me out of emotion? He asked her. Well, not exactly like that. Emotionally. But she came to my house recently. Not alone. Another man gave her a ride. They had a nice conversation, joking about something she said, trying to add more fuel to the fire. Didn't you get it? Matthew tensed. Why are you surprised? When a woman is beautiful, you have to keep an eye on her. She threw off the blanket and walked to the window, completely naked. She took out a cigarette and lit it with her lighter. Matthew had never seen Rose smoke before. Don't look so surprised, it's just that as a mother I have to set a good example for my daughter, she mumbled, meaning that she never smoked in front of her daughter. Matthew was a little shocked at what Rosa had just told him. And who knows whether to believe her or not. Matthew returned home. He walked past his wife for a long time, remembering the words his mother-in-law had said to him. Jennifer was still not feeling well. She had already gone to the doctor, and the doctor said that she was probably allergic to beautiful substances. This surprised the girl a little, since it was not the first time she used them. And Matthew, after the new facts about his wife, suddenly began to think that she might have been cheating on him for a long time already. With the help of such thoughts, he was able to somehow reduce the absurdity of his own actions. What can you do? We all have our sins. Matthew asked how Jennifer was feeling. She told him that it would take time for the toxin to completely leave her system. Matthew listened to what she said, but he didn't believe her. He needed to get on with his business. He kissed her on the cheek, not his usual lips, and walked out the door. Rosa called him today, too. She asked for a meeting. They found a secluded cafe, where they sat at a far table. There was a friendly atmosphere, pleasant quiet music was playing in the cafe. The couple ordered some food for themselves, but as soon as Rosa moved her plate to her, she said, "Is something wrong?" Matthew asked. "No, nothing's wrong." "On the contrary," she said. Matthew became alert and looked at his companion even more carefully. "Matt, this may come as a surprise to you, but I'm very happy about it. I never thought I'd get to experience this again," she said. She had a slight smile on her face. "What do you mean?" Matthew asked again, not knowing what other surprises he could expect from this woman. "I'm so happy, because you and I are going to have a baby," she said. Matthew froze in place. This was an overwhelming information for him. In an instant, his mind was jumbled. Was it serious? He decided to ask. "Of course it is. Why would I lie to you? I already realize that you and I are both in a difficult situation. You and I have made a mess of things. And we've dragged someone close to both of us into it. But since you and I made this mess, it's up to you and me to clean it up. Don't we?" She glared at Matthew. "And what do you suggest?" he asked again. It seemed like he should be excited about having a baby. But right now he felt like a complete idiot. What a mess. What was he thinking? "This may sound strange, but I think it's the right thing to do if you and I get married. Then you and I will already have our child legally married," Rose mumbled. "What about Jennifer?" Matthew asked her. "What about Jennifer? She's got her whole life ahead of her. She'll find someone," Rosa replied, not seeing anything strange here at all. After spending some more time together and discussing the circumstances in more detail, the lovers said goodbye. After all this, Matthew did not know how to look his wife in the eye. The only thing that saved him was the fact that Jennifer was not so pure either and might have been seeing someone else in parallel with him for a long time. Rosa's words sounded so convincing that Matthew was willing to believe the absurdity of it. Perhaps he was more comfortable with it himself. At least in a way, it justified his sins. Meanwhile, Rosa continued to insist. She began to call Matthew more often and to broach the subject of their marriage. "Matthew, perhaps this is our destiny, you and I. If you look at it from that perspective, Jennifer was just the reason we were able to meet you. Have you thought about that?" Rose asked him. To be honest, Matthew was already completely confused and had no idea how to sort it all out and put it all in its proper place. "Matthew, listen to me. When I first saw you, I knew right away that you were the man of my life. You are a very good man, and I can't believe that you could do this to me. You wouldn't abandon me and our future child," she mouthed with an iron voice. Matthew was horrified. He managed to swallow something. He didn't want to hurt anyone at all, to bring suffering. But things were shaping up this way, and he was finding himself the main culprit for everything going on in his situation. No matter how it was done, he would betray someone, whether it was Jennifer or Rose, who was now carrying a child under her heart. Completely confused in his thoughts, Matthew decided to meet his friend. He had long ago invited him to visit him, promising to prepare a luxurious bath with fragrant birch and fir brooms. "Ben, hello. Listen, why am I calling? Are we going to have a bath soon?" he inquired. "Hello, dear, hello. Of course, come, we'll arrange a bathhouse of the highest order. You'll be satisfied," and that's 100% his best friend assured him. Matthew didn't hesitate to pack the necessary things and headed straight to his place. The bathhouse was really great. The damp heat, the strong aroma of fir and birch. And after that, hot kebabs and hot drinks were waiting for them. Taking a break from the positive stress and knocking off a little hunger, Matthew decided to tell Ben about all the things that had been going on with him lately. "Bro, you're screwed, I'll tell you," Tidy mouthed, sending a golden piece of meat into his mouth. "I'll tell you what. I don't envy you," he pronounced, relaxing heartily. But to be honest, it's certainly no laughing matter around here. And anyway, here's what I think: that Rose of yours is a real piece of work. Fooling you, and she's not the least bit embarrassed about it, Ben said. What makes you think that? Honestly, I haven't noticed it, Matthew replied. Well, it's plain to see. She's manipulating you, blackmailing you for some reason, scaring you into telling your daughter. Why doesn't she love her daughter so much? It's not often you see a mother trying to steal a man away from her own daughter, Ben said. She probably got you a big discount, didn't she? Ben squinted his right eye. Yes, I got a good discount, but it wasn't because of her, it was because of my wife. Matthew replied. Yes, of course I understood that, Ben said. Of course, Matt, it's up to you. But your story smells like something unpleasant. He raised his glass and said, Let's drink that we never go off course, that no one confuses us. Matthew supported him fully, and both of them emptied their glasses in a gulp. The pickles on the saucer finally ran out. After his conversation with Ben, Matthew began to see the situation differently. Why would Rosa be slandering her daughter? She's doing everything she can to keep Matthew with her and dump Jennifer. To get to know Rosa better, he decided to strike up a conversation with his wife about her mother. Listen, I have an unmarried friend. Why don't I introduce him to Rosa? She's not too bad. She could start a family, Matthew suggested. You don't know Rosa very well, Jennifer replied. My mother is a man-hater or a feminist. She believes a man has to earn her love. And she used to say that love doesn't exist, it's a fantasy. Matthew would never have thought that about Rose. On the contrary, she seemed a passionate, sensual woman who respected men. That evening, Matthew received a phone call from Rosa. She missed him and wanted to see him. Matthew looked back at Jennifer, who had laid down after dinner. Because of her indisposition, the medication had not helped much. The girl was lying on her back, head turned to the right. She looked so sweet and defenseless. Matthew suddenly felt a strong twinge of remorse. But Rose was waiting on the other end, and he said he would come over. When Matthew walked in, Rosa's belly was already visible. Had it really been that long? He wondered. Honey? It's different for everyone. I think we're having a boy, she said, kissing him on the lips. Matthew looked at Rose differently now, remembering Ben's words. Rosa offered dinner and started talking about marriage again, saying she had to hurry. She didn't want to get married with a big belly, but to be slim and beautiful. While she was talking about marriage, Matthew was desperately trying to figure out how to fix the situation. Rose didn't seem to notice his detachment. Which dress should I wear, the gold or the beige? She asked, showing him a wedding magazine. Matthew shrugged and poked at the last one at random. He was looking at a woman who didn't care about the feelings of others, like his own mother. After all, she hadn't thought about what it would be like for her daughter. Rose could sense that Matthew was hesitating to make a final choice. She didn't like that, and it made her jealous of him. Matthew, I've already decided everything, so tomorrow we're going to the registry office with you and apply, because to procrastinate further is to further drown in lies. She was saying all the right things. Matthew agreed with her, but he couldn't imagine what it would all look like at all. He felt a tremendous sense of guilt in front of Rosa, of duty, because now they would have a child. In the end, Matthew decided that it would be better if he and Rosa got married and lived together. And he'd explained to Jennifer that it was just the way it was. That's what he was, an unprincipled fool. He thought he'd tell her that if she didn't forgive him, he'd understand, and that she was entitled to it. The next day, Matthew and Rose headed for the registry office. They decided to sign first, and then, when Jennifer found out about everything, they would play the wedding. Both of them were a little worried, but in the end, everything went smoothly. Rose wanted to celebrate the event and therefore went to a cafe. Next to the wedding palace was a pretty good cafe with a very interesting interior. There were wide armchairs of dark blue color, and each table was separated by a dense curtain, which served as a kind of noise insulation, absorbing sounds. They ordered hot dishes and green tea with lemon and sugar. Rose showed that she was happy with her new status. Matthew tried to look friendly and didn't show that he was still in shock at what he had gotten himself into. Meanwhile, Jennifer had been to the doctor. She was feeling much better. However, the doctor recommended that she diet and not skip meals, so that her body would have the strength to fight, so that she would have a strong immune system. But since she was already hungry, she went to the nearest cafe, which was near the wedding palace. She remembered that she and Matthew had wanted to come here every time, but still hadn't gotten around to it. And this place was quite nice. Jennifer didn't stand for long. She picked a corner for herself and seated herself at the first table where her gaze fell. She ordered her favorite sautéed mushrooms, a salad, and a brownie. She took the first course and already sent several spoonfuls of broth into her mouth. But then she heard what she thought was a familiar voice. At first she didn't pay attention, but then she heard another voice, this time belonging to a man, and as she could guess, to her husband. It was her husband and her mother talking. At first she thought it was just a coincidence. Perhaps the intoxication had already caused her to hallucinate. She even laughed to herself about it. Yes, her brain had independently determined pretty quickly who they belonged to. Logically, however, it didn't fit in Jennifer's head. At first she thought they were talking about the house. She wanted to get up and walk over to them, but stopped when she heard it. I can imagine her surprise when she finds out that you and I are getting married soon, and you're pregnant too. Jennifer froze in shock. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, and it made her turn into one big ear. Becoming invisible, she carefully pulled back the curtains and actually saw Matthew and his mother. They were holding hands and looking at each other like two lovebirds. Jennifer couldn't listen to this any further. She couldn't stand it any longer and walked over to them and asked what it was all about. Matthew was a little frightened. Rose, on the other hand, felt empowered and superior. She looked at her daughter contemptuously. "Why are you so surprised?" Bold, brazen, she asked. "But you are my mother, and this is my husband," exclaimed the wife, shifting her gaze from one to the other. "A double betrayal. No, it can't be." And then Rosa decided not to be silent any longer. "I have devoted my whole life to my daughter and completely forgot about myself. Don't I have the right to love?" she asked, staring at her daughter as if she were a victim of circumstances. The daughter had nothing to add. She was especially disgusted that Matthew was not going to comfort her or justify himself. The girl's eyes filled with tears. She stared into her husband's eyes for a few seconds and then turned around and walked out of the cafe. Matthew wanted to run after her, but Rose stopped him. There was no need to do that. "It's time to get things straight," she said. In the meantime, Jennifer returned to Matthew's apartment, where she was living as his wife. She didn't want to stay here any longer and continue drowning in lies. She packed up her things and left for her best friend's house. It was not easy to bear such a blow from both sides. The girl suffered, cried, and felt incredible heartache. Matthew had already finished the house, and he and Rosa were going to go there to spend the weekend. Rosa's belly had grown considerably. There was nothing to hide it now. She wore maternity pants and a wide coffee-colored sweater. Matthew was also looking for clothes that suited him. He couldn't find his favorite sweatshirt. Going through all the closets, he suddenly came across a strange foam sweatshirt, a new uniform. He twirled it around until he put it on his stomach and realized it was a belly pad. Matthew stood in front of the mirror, trying to figure out how the thing had ended up in the apartment and why it was even needed. The next moment, Rosa entered the room. "Why are you going through my things?" she asked, having accused him of impudence. "Don't you want to tell me what it is?" he asked, although he had already guessed everything. Rose began to frantically think of explanations to justify herself and not be exposed. But Matthew was so shocked by the devious woman's shenanigans that he demanded that she tell him immediately. The same woman, remaining in her repertoire, began to accuse him of disrespecting her as the mother of his future child. Matthew could not stand it, approached her, and tried to take off her clothes by force. A real struggle ensued. Matthew and Rosa collapsed on the bed. The guy literally undressed Rosa, pulling off her sweater and leggings. She was screaming, telling him not to touch her stomach, that she would call the police. Suddenly, one button flew off to the side, and then a second and a third. And the next moment in Matthew's hand was a false belly almost the same as the one he had measured before, only a little smaller. He couldn't hide his amazement at how believable she was. A real uproar broke out in the room. Matthew couldn't believe that he could have been so deceived. "I'm leaving. I won't tolerate deception," he said. "You're a real destroyer. You don't care about the feelings of the people you care about. If that's the case, you're on your own. Grab your bag and go. You're not getting anything anyway." "Why?" she threw, as if she had assumed such an outcome and was sure that he would not find anything and would not dare to take this step. But her hopes were in vain, and so Matthew left her alone. Rose, having finally gotten rid of her belly, continued to live her life as before. She wasn't going to reconcile with her daughter just yet. Perhaps pride wouldn't allow it. But soon a notice arrived in her name that she had to leave the apartment. The mother was horrified. She didn't understand why she had to leave her home, where she had lived for many years. Gathering herself, she went to the notary. An elderly man in an expensive jacket and a white shirt helped her understand, scrutinizing everything. He told Rosa that when Matthew was married to her daughter, she had signed the apartment over to him, and when he married her mother, he had registered the house for himself. "But that's impossible. I've been cheated," screamed Rosa, trying to get justice. But the notary said that all questions now to her daughter. Rosa decided not to tell her directly at first, but to pretend that it was Matthew who had abandoned her. When she came to her daughter, who was staying with a friend, she started crying, telling her that Matthew had abandoned her. She had lost her baby because of the stress. He was ruthless and heartless. Jennifer, arms crossed, listened to her, standing in the hallway. Rose sat back in her chair. Her lips were pressed together in indignation. She tried diligently to squeeze out a tear to relieve her daughter. But Jennifer had grown up and understood a lot. You could say she was convinced that her mother was a narcissist and a cynic. Pulling an empty bottle from her pocket with the name of the poison on it, Jennifer tossed it to her mother. She found the poison when she was packing. Her daughter decided not to feel sorry for her and told her the truth. "I always knew you didn't love your father. I knew you cheated on him, and I saw him suffer. You wanted him out of the apartment, and you were the reason he was gone." Jennifer blurted out the horrible truth to her mother. No, that's not true," Rosa denied with trembling lips, clutching the empty bottle in her fist. But looking into her daughter's eyes, she realized that her next lie would not go away. The whole point was that the mother was from a simple family. When she was young, she was very beautiful, and when she dated a guy, she was sure she could find a better option. She had to marry Jason when she found out she was pregnant. Rosa never liked him and wanted to get rid of him. It also weighed on her that she couldn't go back to her old life because she had a young daughter to take care of, love, and raise. She was too strong. Sadness enveloped her at the thought that her life was over. After all, her husband was an average man with an average salary on which one could only go on vacation if one saved for a very long time. Eventually, all of this, including her husband, became unbearably hard to tolerate, and at one point she decided to get rid of him. At night, Jason would have choking attacks. There were times when Rosa would purposely cause them so that he would come to his senses. One night, Jason was short of breath again. Rose woke up, A dog named Mike also woke up. He came into little Jennifer's room and started whining. The girl opened her eyes and thought the dog was thirsty. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway. As she passed her parents' room, she saw that they were awake too. She decided to look in on them. But as soon as her head poked through the half-open door, little Jennifer froze in place. With her own eyes, she saw her mother smothering her father with a pillow in cold blood and without pity. The girl's eyes filled with horror. She was so frightened by what she saw that she preferred to remain unnoticed and quietly returned to the room. At first, she thought she had misunderstood. But when her mother told her the next morning that her father had died, she realized that her eyes had not deceived her that night. The child resolved never to tell anyone about it, ever. The daughter lived with this and could not understand her mother in any way. But because she loved her own father very much, she wished to avenge him. And when she met Matthew, she had a plan. With his help, she was able to take all of her mother's possessions and leave her penniless. Now that her mother had found out that Jennifer had known all these years who had killed her father, she was seriously scared for her life. Without making a noise, she rose from her chair and walked out the door. From then on, mother and daughter never saw each other again. Matthew and Jennifer, on the other hand, were reunited. That's how things in life even fall into place over time.